Chapter 2408. Furnace almost word for word. Dragon 1 said the same thing to the Dragon Kings. Hansen didn't know what they were planning, and neither did he want to know. He flew through space for around an hour, before he found a lone core xenogeniac flying through the darkness. That xenogeniac looked very unusual. It hung against the empty background of space like a burning smithy's furnace. Its body looked to be made of steel, and its cogwheel-composed body was wrapped with countless chains. A fiery red core glowed on its top. Hansen flew right up to the big furnace, but before he became within range, the furnace's opening shot a geyser of fire at him. It looked like a volcano erupting. The enormous wave of flame spread as it came forward, and in 1 second, a few dozen miles were covered in that raging blaze. Hansen felt as if his body was going to melt. Without hesitation, he summoned the purple and red laser gun and sent his power into it. He fired it at the big furnace. The laser gun unleashed a beam of red and purple light. The purple and red light shot right through the fire area and struck the big furnace without even slowing down. Pang! The furnace's body was 10 meters wide. Hansen's beam of light punched through the furnace, then spread out from the puncture wound to consume the entire creature. The core demon bug gun has a consuming power. Not bad at all. The only frustrating thing is that the consuming power works slowly, and the radius isn't as large as the original creature's consuming area. Hansen quite liked his new gun. The big furnace heaved out fire as it turned to run, but it was full of holes after Hansen riddled it with a few more shots. In the end, the creature exploded. The fire within the furnace went off like a firework as the creature detonated. Core Xenogeniac King hunted Smithy Furnace. Core Xenogeniac gene found. Hansen flew around and grabbed the red claw that had fallen out of the creature. He placed the claw in his pocket and flew forward to find other things to slay. After flying for another half an hour or so, Hansen found another one of those furnaces. He rushed over and blew the furnace up, receiving another core Xenogeniac gene for his trouble. This part of the core area seemed like a space dedicated to the furnaces. After 10 hours of soaring, Hansen had managed to kill a total of 6 furnaces. Although none of them gave him a beast soul, the mere ability to harvest Xenogeniac genes was pleasing to Han Sr. At this rate, I will become very rich. Hansen was very happy with the progress he had made thus far, and so he continued to fly forward. After another short while of travel, he found a place populated by many asteroids. He saw another flying furnace too. As Hansen looked closer, he noticed that this furnace was different from all the other furnaces he had thus far encountered. The other furnaces were around a dozen meters tall, and they were made of a featureless black steel. This furnace was only 3 or 4 meters tall, however. It was made of copper, and the core of the furnace and the fires inside were bronze. The weirdest thing about this one, though, was that there was a sword sticking out of it. That sword was almost wholly swallowed by the flames. It was very red, and something about it was particularly eye-catching. Is this another subspecies of the flying furnaces? There is a sword inside. This looks higher class than those black furnaces, but the power I sense from it doesn't seem to be much stronger. The other furnaces were kings of the 1st or 2nd tier, but this guy has an area that is at the 3rd or 4th tier at the most. Hansen had come to kill Xenogeniacs, so he didn't put any more thought into it. He pulled out his gun and fired more of his red and purple beams at the furnace. That furnace was sitting atop a giant asteroid. It was breathing, inhaling some sort of power from the universe. Every breath made the fire burn bright and hot. Hansen's red and purple beam of light landed on the copper furnace, blowing a big chunk blown out of the creature. The copper furnace tumbled away from its position, bouncing off other asteroids as it went. The copper flame of the furnace also struck the asteroids, leaving behind trails of scorching fire. Hansen was shocked. The core demon bug gun was a mutant king beast soul, but the shot was unable to cut all the way through the copper furnace. The beam of light had only dented the creature's surface, and the consuming powers weren't able to latch on. The copper furnace righted itself before long, and it looked very angry. It spat out a long geyser of fire, venting its rage like some flaming demon. Hansen didn't feel sorry for the creature though. He just fired his gun at it again. On the inside he was thinking, I need to strike as quickly as I can. The body of this copper furnace is nothing weak, but if I shoot it a few more times, I should be able to break it. The purple and red beam flew toward the furnace again, but the furnace released a red light that intercepted the beam. It looked like the burning red light had come from the sword inside the furnace. Pang! Two powers hit each other, and the collision produced a beautiful shower of sparks. Then, to Han Sen's surprise, sparks began to spill from the sword inside the furnace. The sword didn't break though. The beam from the core demon bug gun was dispersed by the impact, and it spread harmlessly into the reaches of space. The sword inside the furnace made sizzling noises. The fire inside the copper furnace popped and crackled like it was talking to the sword. A copper-colored flame area covered the entire galaxy, wrapping over both Han Sen and the furnace. But Han Sen couldn't feel the heat. It was like the copper flame area was some sort of mirage. The copper flame area intensified, and the sword grew hotter and hotter. It turned to translucent gold, and strange symbols appeared across its length. Han Sen felt fear awaken inside him. He quickly raised and fired his gun a few more times. But the sword flew and danced, hitting every single projectile with its sword lights. The copper fire area was still present, and the sword continued to absorb it. The body of the golden sword became a green crystal, and it burned with a copper fire. It looked both pretty and disturbing. Han Sen frowned. The sword seemed so powerful. Powerful enough to frighten him. This is a strong Xenogeniac. It is just 3rd or 4th tier. But its area power is boosting the sword inside the furnace to unbelievable levels. The sword's power is at least half deified by this point. This is amazing. Han Sen was shocked. But he didn't want to back off now. He summoned Move Mountain Area, curious to see just how strong this special furnace Xenogeniac really was. The crystal sword was burning with a copper fire. The sword groaned as it broke the sky. It was teleporting toward Han Sen's heart. Han Sen aimed a punch at the flying sword. His armor was imbued with Move Mountain Area, so his defense would be very strong. Han Sen didn't have to be scared of the power wielded by the sword. Pang! The tip of the sword thudded into Han Sen's fist. The sword carved a deep gash in the armored fist, and blood began to drip out. Chapter 2409. Sword from the Furnace, a very powerful sword. Han Sen lowered his head and stared at his fist. Despite being imbued with Move Mountain Area, the armor covering his fist had been sliced clean through. His fingers were bleeding. He was just thankful that the bones were undamaged. The sword from the furnace came to strike a second time. But this strike was going to be harder than the last one. The sword moved so fast that Han Sen could barely follow it with his eyes. Catcha! Han Sen grabbed the blade of the sword from the furnace, which drew more streams of blood from his hands. He kept gripping the blade though. The sword from the furnace shook as if it was trying to move forward. But Han Sen held on tight and kept the blade still. The copper furnace's fire blazed higher. The fire area covered everything again. The sword from the furnace absorbed that fire, and the sword grew even more transparent. Its power increased, and it thrust toward Han Sen's heart again. The blade sliced deeper into Han Sen's hands. Blood spilled around the sharp edges of the sword, but even still, Han Sen refused to let go. He resettled his grip on the sword, tightening his hands as he tried to force back the sword from the furnace. The tip of the sword from the furnace almost touched Han Sen's chest. The green crystal blade looked like a venomous snake as it shook and writhed in Han Sen's hands. It was trying to strike at his heart, but its movements had been restricted. The copper furnace was rising, drawing in energy from the galaxy all around it as it went. The fire burned higher and hotter. The bronze fire area encompassed everything again. The sword from the furnace absorbed a fire area, and it received a godly boost of power. It unleashed a level of strength that was hard to imagine. It slid forward through Han Sen's hands, unstoppable. Catcha! The sword began slicing through the armor on Han Sen's chest. He kept trying to push the fierce blade back, but he couldn't. Blood was now pouring from Han Sen's hands, and it was only a matter of time before it started cutting into his finger bones. The blade had sunk 5 centimeters into Han Sen's chest at this point, and it was about to touch his heart. The copper furnace was dancing happily. The fire within it was doing a jig. and the flames took on the shape of a smiling emoji that stared right at Han Sr. "You are really strong. But this has got to stop," Han Sen said to the copper furnace, his hands still holding the blade. The sword from the furnace was very strong, but after those first few attacks, the scary power had moved into the Dongxian armor. It wouldn't be as easy for the sword from the furnace to pierce through the Dongxian armor now. "Catcha!" Han Sen summoned his strength and pushed against the sword from the furnace. His grip on the blade should have been tenuous at best, but no matter how much the sword tried to struggle, it couldn't break free from Han Sen's clasp. The copper furnace's fire blazed furiously again and released another fire area. The fire area wasn't dangerous by itself, but it buffed the sword from the furnace an alarming amount. Every time the fire area appeared, it made the sword from the furnace much stronger. And that buffing capability appeared to be limitless. Because the sword from the furnace grew stronger every time, that meant that the area effect was stackable. This stackable area was the first Han Sen had seen. Han Sen's eyes hardened as he grabbed the sword from the furnace. He pulled the sword out of his chest as the fire area suddenly disappeared. Aside from the small fire that still flickered within the copper furnace, there were no other sparks. Han Sen had been running his Dongxian area at max power. It forced the copper furnace's universal self-cogwheel to stop, extinguishing the fire area. The copper furnace was shivering. The cogwheels inside the furnace were spinning very quickly, trying to draw enough energy from the space around it to fuel the fire area again. But no matter how fast they spun, the creature couldn't ignore its area power. It was like trying to strike a wet match. Unless the opponent was stronger than Han Sen, the Dongxian area would force them to use their universal self-cogwheel. If they didn't, they would have no power inside the Dongxian area. The copper furnace itself wasn't too strong. It was just a second or third tier king xenogeneic. But its fire area, when used in concert with the sword from the furnace, had incredible power. After a few buffs, the sword from the furnace was at least as good as a half-deified being. This was the first time Han Sen had seen this type of xenogeneic. The copper furnace wanted to spit out some more fire, but no matter how hard it tried, it couldn't even generate a plume of smoke. "It's my turn now." Holding the sword from the furnace in one hand, Han Sen lifted his core demon bug gun in the other. He fired at the copper furnace like a madman. Because of the move mountain area, Han Sen's movement speed was slow. There was no way that he could have attacked the copper furnace by hand at this point. But the core demon bug gun's firing speed was unchanged. Pang! 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 The purple and red beam crashed into the copper furnace, and the creature was sent flying. The furnace collected dents all over its surface as it bounced through the asteroid field. "Why is this guy so hard?" Han Sen was stunned. He had used his core demon bug gun to shoot at it for ages. He covered the copper furnace with dents and dings, but he was unable to break it, and the consuming power couldn't latch onto his enemy. The copper furnace looked to be in bad shape, but it had only taken minor injuries. It hadn't sustained any serious harm. A third or fourth tier king xenogeneic has such a weird area, and its body is so hard. This is very strange. Han Sen frowned. But Han Sen had come too far to let things go now. He kept using his core demon bug gun to shoot at the copper furnace, resolving to shoot the thing as much as he needed to in order to break it. Han Sen's precise shots continued nailing the furnace. The creature was still flying, but rather than trying to get away from Han Sen, it was coming closer. The furnace jerked forward like it was riding a roller coaster in space. The sword from the furnace kept struggling within Han Sen's hand, but it couldn't shake him loose. Pang! Finally, after Han Sen had been shooting for what seemed like forever, one side of the copper furnace took a little too much damage. The purple and red light blew a fist-sized hole in the surface. The hole wasn't large, but Han Sen felt instantly relieved. The size wasn't a problem. If he could pierce it, then he could destroy it. Han Sen planned to keep on firing, but the copper furnace began to make wheezing, crying sounds. The Dongxian area was still locking down all the cogwheels in the nearby space, and no matter how hard it tried, it couldn't create any more fire areas. Suddenly, Han Sen heard a deafening metallic shriek. This sound wasn't coming from the copper furnace though. Han Sen raised his head. He turned and saw a giant copper furnace coming toward him. It was as big as a planet, and thousands of swords circled it like a raging river. Every sword looked like the sword from the furnace in Han Sen's hand. They burned with a weird green fire that looked somehow crystalline. As far as Han Sen could see, the galaxy was covered in a stream of swords, and the world became a sea of flashing blades. Chapter 24:10. Stream of Swords. The huge furnace's appearance caught Han Sen completely off guard. He quickly shoved as much power as possible into his Dongxian area. It was impossible for him to completely stop the swords from the furnace and the fire area. This giant copper furnace was a genuine half-deified beast. It was probably only one small step away from being deified. It was almost stronger than Dragon One. But thankfully, it didn't have substance chains, so it couldn't be a real deified. The Dongxian area couldn't completely seal power, but it still affected the universal cogwheels. It made the universal cogwheels spin slower, which led to a reduction in power. Plus, with the Move Mountain area, Han Sen wasn't really afraid of that stream of swords, though they did look very scary. Dong! Han Sen waved the sword from the furnace that was in his hand, and knocked away a bunch of the raining swords that were coming dangerously close. But ultimately, the sword rain was too much to defend against, and each one of those swords wielded a frightening power. Each attack came with the strength of a half-deified creature. A blade hit Han Sen, cutting open the Dongxian armor. Fortunately, Move Mountain area was able to absorb a lot of power from the attacks it had sustained. It was able to shrug off the attack of a half-deified being. The sword rain could leave deep scratches in the Dongxian armor, but it couldn't pierce all the way through. Blade after blade slammed into the armor. It was like a flash flood. Each one kept left a scrape across the armor's surface. The strikes got dangerously close to Han Sen's flesh, and he almost yelled out in alarm. The waterfall of swords kept pounding Han Sen's body. Under such violent attacks, this king seemed just as threatening as a deified xenogeniac. While the deified bug Han Sen had fought was incredibly powerful, it didn't have any ranged attacks, so the kings with Han Sen still had a chance to run away. But beneath the sword rain that blanketed the sky, there was nowhere to run. No matter how strong a person's defenses were, getting continuously struck by that sword waterfall would eventually lead to him getting perforated. It was the same principle Han Sen had been counting on when he attacked the copper furnace. But this stream of attacks wasn't made up of water. It was composed of swords wielding half-deified power. If it was anyone else with any different type of area power, they would have died within the first messy barrage of that stream of swords. Even their bones would have been crushed. Luckily, Han Sen had his Move Mountain area for protection. As all those sword streams came down on the Dongxian armor, they provided an incredible buff to the armor's defensive properties. As long as the first few attacks didn't break the Move Mountain area, using the Dongxian armor as the carrier made him invincible. The small copper furnace flew over to the big copper furnace. The mouth of the furnace kept spitting out fire, as it made a pitiful whining noise. It seemed to be telling the big copper furnace of its woes. After the big copper furnace heard what it was told, it became enraged. It released a wave of green fire that looked like it could incinerate a planet. The fire area came down and covered the swords from the furnaces. The swords received the fire area's buff, and their powers rose to a terrifying level. Dragon One was flying through space. After Dia Robber left, he went around, following in the direction Han Sen had gone. He kept on the move, but he didn't see Han Sr. Han Sen had been traveling fast, clearly intending to kill as many xenogeniacs as possible. Dragon One and Dia Robber had talked for a while before going their separate ways. It made sense that Dragon One had yet to catch up with Han Sr. Moving forward more leads to the core furnace zone. The strongest core furnace is halfway to being deified. It doesn't have its own substance chain yet, but it is stronger than most half-deified beings. And there are scary swords inside that furnace. Many kings and half-deifieds have confronted it, but none of them have been able to kill it. I wonder why Dollar is headed there. Is he going to fight the core furnace alone? Dragon One looked forward and frowned. He was still traveling forward, but he suddenly glanced over his shoulder. He saw a shadow coming toward him. Dragon One watched it suspiciously, and when he saw the person clearly, he raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Dear Robber. What a coincidence. We meet again so soon." Dear Robber smiled and flew towards Dragon 1, stopping right before him. Dragon 1 and Dear Robber looked at each other. They were both smart, so they both knew what the other wanted. "Dear Robber, if you quit now, we will leave Exquisite Mountain. It will belong to you and the other destroyed," Dragon 1 offered quietly. Dear Robber laughed. "Dragon 1, give me $. We do not want Exquisite Mountain. The dragon can keep it." "It looks like we will have to employ our own tricks," Dragon 1 said with a feral grin. "No matter what, $. Will belong to the destroyed," Dear Robber responded coldly. "Even if that is what you want, he might not go with you," Dragon 1 countered. Dear Robber started to say something, but then he noticed some green flames far in the distance. The light reflected off of clouds of dust that had risen from the turmoil, and countless swords could be seen flying against the dusty backdrop. $. Went to the core furnaces? Dear Robber's face changed. Dragon 1 frowned. "It seems that way." Dear Robber's face changed, but in the end he laughed and looked at Dragon 1. He said, "He really dares to go in there? Does he want to kill the core furnace? Not bad. Now we can gauge how strong he is. You will want to know as well, right?" Dragon 1 had a wry smile. He and Dear Robber were thinking the same thing. They both wanted to use $'s powers to fight the core area's deified xenogeneics. The core area's deified xenogeneics were a very large prize, because no deified could enter this place. Claiming that prize was a very difficult process. Many different elites of varying races had attempted to bring down core deifieds, but they all had failed. Even the Extreme King had to rally many half-deified people to pull off such a hunt. The dragon and the destroyed had achieved some modicum of success in the past, but they had to rally many half-deifieds in their attempts. That also meant they lost a lot of people in the battles, and when the benefits were split among those who remained, there was never much for each person. Nothing to compensate for the danger and losses incurred. Therefore, over the past few years, there hadn't been many chances to hunt deified xenogeneics. The strength of deified xenogeneics varied widely, and the weaker variety were generally targeted by hunters. Once those deified xenogeneics were killed, only the strong deified xenogeneics remained, and over time, those monsters became even stronger. Killing them was now a much harder endeavor than it had once been. Like the weird bug they recently encountered, it was a powerful deified xenogeneic. Even if they gathered many half-deified elites, there'd be a very low chance of actually taking out that horrifying creature. Chapter 24:11. Invincible defense. People like Han Sun, who could survive a conflict with a deified xenogeneic, were really helpful when it came to taking down deified xenogeneics. Dear Robber and Dragon 1 both knew the value of recruiting $' to their respective causes. Even a party of Extreme King would be willing to hire Han Sun to fight for them. Kings wanted to hunt down deified creatures, and the Extreme King could sometimes do that, but only if they found a weak deified. The stronger deified beings were too powerful for even the Extreme King to handle. Dear Robber and Dragon 1 exchanged a glance, then flew towards the fire area at almost the same time. "This looks very bad. The core furnace just triggered its third fire area. The swords from the furnace are strong enough to kill a half-deified elite now." When Dear Robber got a better view of the battlefield, he couldn't help but frown. The core furnace had remained alive while deified xenogeneics were killed around it, because its power and fire area were too scary. It wasn't like no one had tried to take it down before. A group of half-deifieds had worked together to attack the creature before, but their attempt failed beneath that sword rain. A few of the half-deified elites were even killed before they could escape. The large sword rain and the stacking fire area was a nightmare for the kings that challenged this beast. It wasn't something that could be overcome simply by assembling more people to go up against it. Dragon 1 nodded. "The fire area has stacked 3 times. Not even our last generation Dragon 13, who has the strongest defense, would have been able to block this. And he was half-deified." As they talked, they carefully kept themselves well outside of the fire area. They didn't dare enter. There were 3 fire area buffs and rivers of swords in front of them. If they went inside, they wouldn't be coming out alive. Plus, That core furnace was brewing its fourth fire area. But when they peered down through the haze of swords, their faces changed. Han's sun was wrapped in a blue glow, and rivers of swords were washing over his body from every angle. It was so scary that the two half-deifieds felt a little numb at the sight. Those scary sword streams slammed into Hansen's body, but they couldn't break through the defense of his armor. Han's sun hung in the air as countless green crystal swords from the furnace came soaring down to strike him, then bounced off like they were made of cheap wood. Against Hansen's armor, those scary swords that could kill half-deified beings were nothing more than raindrops. Boom! As they watched, the core furnace's cogwheels and chains moved, opening the furnace so it could absorb universal energies. Then the entrance port of the furnace spat out a volcano of green fire. The new fire area spread, then settled over the swords from the furnace. The swords from the furnace absorbed the fire area and crystallized further. Many of the swords now looked like green jewelry. They were glowing with light and fire, and each one of them looked like some mythic weapon of legend. The fourth fire area. Diarobber's lips pressed into a thin line. Dragon 1 looked glum. 4 fire areas were now buffing the swords from the furnace. Each sword now wielded the power of a top half-deified being. Every one of them was equal to Dragon 1's power. There were many swords, and they swirled through space like some angry crystalline hurricane. If that core furnace could go out into the Geno universe, it could wipe out many of the higher races. Its storm of swords was like an army of half-deified xenogeneics. Of course, the core furnace had its downsides as well. Every time it absorbed power from the universe, it shouldered the burden of casting another fire area. Each fire area it cast was a strain on its strength, so it couldn't continue stacking its area power forever. 4 fire area buffs were almost all the core furnace could endure. If the fire area continued to stack, the furnace itself might buckle and melt under the strain. If the furnace was unlucky enough to encounter a powerful deified xenogeneic, the deified wouldn't let the fire area stack up that many times. The deified would just smash through the storm of swords and break the furnace in one hit. But right now, the furnace had managed to build up 4 layers of the fire area. The power it now wielded was truly frightening. It wasn't something a normal deified xenogeneic could deal with. A flash flood of swords approached Han's sun, blanketing the space around him. Dragon 1 and Diarobber's eyebrows rose. The pressure of the situation was getting to them, and they clenched their fists. Can Dollar survive this? Dragon 1 and Diarobber stared at Han's sun, hovering alone in his blue area. Boom! The waterfall of swords came crashing down on Han's senator. They buried Han's sun under a seething mountain of green jade. The raging stream of swords kept coming down, and it felt like so much mass was converging that a black hole was about to form, right there in space. Sweat tricked down the foreheads of Dragon 1 and Diarobber. If this kind of attack came at one of them, their bodies would be torn to shreds. It wasn't a matter of enduring it through force of will. It was an incredible power that had been designed for the sole purpose of killing enemies. It was impossible to endure unless the defender had more raw power than the attack. No amount of reinforcements or additional troops could overcome something like this. Water was very weak in small quantities, but when enough water gathered in one place, it could become a tsunami. Even tall buildings could be toppled by such forces of nature. The swords of the core furnace held that same awe-inspiring power. The impacts of the sword stream were so loud that Dragon 1 and Diarobber could barely hear each other. Their eyes stared at the blue light in the middle of the sword stream. The blue light area had yet to be swallowed, and that meant Dollar was not yet dead. Surviving under such circumstances was nothing short of a miracle. Boom! The falling sword stream began to slow down, and Dragon 1 and Diarobber could finally see Han's sun through the small gaps between the swords. Han's sun stood calmly in place. He was fearless like some sort of god. He let those swords from the furnace collide with his armor, and he made no effort to block them. None of the swords could break through his defenses. Dragon 1 and Diarobber were both shocked and happy. What kind of area and armor power does Dollar have? He remained uninjured beneath the weight of those attacks. They could barely believe the strength of Hansen's defenses, but it gave them hope. With such a powerful defense, stalling a deified xenogeneic might be possible. Chapter 24:12. Fighting face-to-face move mountain area was practically invincible, but Han Sun felt as if he was going to reach the end of his tether soon. There was no problem with the way move mountain area functioned, but there was a limit to the amount of power that the Dongsquan armor could support. So much power was being funneled into the armor that it was starting to produce cracking sounds like breaking glass. The Dongxian armor was only on its first tier. Although it was the best when compared to others of the same level, that level was simply too low for this situation. The fact that it had endured this long was amazing. If Dongxian armor can level up to its 9th tier and be reset, then the combination of move mountain area and the Dongxian area will make fighting a deified xenogenic face-to-face quite feasible. Han Sun thought to himself. Boom. As Han Sun was thinking, the core furnace was opening to absorb as much universal energy as it could. The furnace's fire flared up brightly. The furnace itself seemed to be changing under the heat. The copper had become semi-transparent, and it glowed with the wavering light of its flames. It looked both very weird and very beautiful. Fire spewed out of it as the 5th fire area poured forth. The greenish fireball became solid like water as it wrapped over the swords from the furnace. Many swords absorbed that 5th fire area power. The swords looked like perfect glass now. They moved like they had been possessed by sword spirits, and dangerous shadows traveled behind them. 5 fire areas? This is very nearly a substance chain power. The core furnace is cheating. Dragon 1 and Dia Robber were both in shock. Their bodies were trembling with intimidation from the sight of all those swords. They weren't scared for their own lives, of course, but the sight of all that power caused a gut reaction that neither of them had expected. Even from this distance, they could feel the dangerous heat of the coming attack. Luckily, Dragon 1 and Dia Robber were top kings. These wisps of sword air would have already forced ordinary kings down onto their knees. Maybe after this fight, that core furnace will become deified, Dragon 1 murmured, his eyes locked on the furnace. Can Dollar withstand it? Dia Robber looked into space. The stream of swords was pointing at Han Senator. The cold sweat running off of the destroyed had soaked his clothing. Han Sun could see that the swords from the furnace were all aiming at him, but he wasn't afraid. He complimented them quietly, saying, "Such a powerful xenogenic. What a shame." As he spoke to himself, Han Sun stretched out a hand. His thumb and middle finger came together, and a coin appeared between them. Han Sun couldn't move. Move mountain area's buffing had made the Dongxian armor too heavy. In addition, the Dongxian armor had reached max capacity. If it absorbed any more power, it was sure to blow up. So now Han Sun had to fight face to face. He had no choice. He has to fight. Upon seeing Han Sun's plan, Dragon 1 and Dia Robber looked unsettled. A first-tier king was going to fight the almost deified furnace. The likelihood of death was very high. They could see Han Sun's situation and hear his armor creaking. There were some small marks starting to appear across it. Clearly, it couldn't endure the suppression of that scary power for much longer. They thought Han Sun was fighting now because he had no other choice. A first-tier king should have had no chance at all against that enormous storm of swords. Han Sun didn't agree, though. The swords from the furnace were scary. Even Move Mountain area and his Dongxian armor couldn't bear them. But the incredible power that had built up within his armor was something that Han Sun could now use. Come on, let the world know the power of collecting taxes. Han Sun growled under his breath. He held the coin tightly between his fingers. Buzz! The coin moaned, and the numbers upon its surface jumped up quickly. 1 2 10 50. The numbers upon the coin blurred as they raced upward. The wave of swords gathered, preparing to head for Han Sun and his coin. Han Sun's coin had 2 skills: saving money and collecting taxes. Saving money could stack up his own power to attack. Collecting taxes came from Han Sun's coin Geno core. Rather than using Han Sun's own power, that skill depended on external powers. Within a certain radius, all creatures with power would sacrifice their own energy to fuel the skill. The stronger the creatures were, the more taxes were collected. Each and every sword from the furnace was wretchedly strong. They were half deified, almost fully deified. There were many of them too. Every sword surrendered a small amount of power, and Han Sun collected their taxes. An unnerving amount of power, gathered on Han Sen's single coin. That coin's power increased to such a level that Han Sen almost couldn't control it. When the furnace groaned, countless swords received their fire buff. That put them on the move. The stream of swords looked like a tsunami descending on Han Senator. Their power blanketed everything, as if they were about to rip space itself apart. Dragon 1 and Dia Robber started to fall back. The stream of swords was too frightening. After that hit, the furnace was sure to become deified. Once that happened, they would have no hope of escaping. Ding! Han Sen finally fired his coin at the smithy furnace. It flew toward the furnace in a streak of gold light. That coin's power was beyond Han Sen's control, and he had no choice but to fire it. If he hadn't, it would have exploded and taken him with it. As the coin flew, the numbers continued to increase, gathering power from the area all around it. The coin's light, compared to the numerous sword lights, was tiny. Its tiny gleam was nothing outstanding. But when the swords from the furnace came into contact with the coin, they broke. They were as weak as soap bubbles, and the gold light continued toward the copper furnace. Dragon 1 and Dia Robber were falling back. They saw Han Sen fire his coin, but due to the heavy sword stream, they couldn't keep track of the small gold light. The scary stream of swords approached Han Sen's body, and the coin came into contact with the copper furnace. Then it produced a crunchy metal noise. It wasn't loud, but it was oddly clear amidst the thunderous noise of the raucous swords. Dragon 1 and Dia Robber turned back to look, their eyes finding the giant furnace. They saw the coin planted on the furnace. Then in the next second, the coin was actually inside the furnace. And then the construct was shrinking. Chapter 24:13. Exploding furnace. The furnace had become semi-transparent under the heat of its own flames. The coin hit the side of the furnace with so much force that it started to cave in on itself. A small hole formed in the surface, and the coin disappeared into that hole. It felt like time was standing still. Dragon 1 and Dia Robber didn't see the coin come out on the other side, so they assumed that the coin was still stuck to the furnace where it had originally landed. They doubted the coin would have enough power to penetrate the furnace. But then they froze in disbelief. The whole furnace was imploding. As if a black hole had formed at the center of the furnace, the whole thing collapsed in on itself. The huge furnace twisted into a small chunk of metal. And this minimizing process continued without stopping. It was like a soda can being crushed under someone's foot. The power inside the furnace continued to collapse its structure. The giant furnace grew smaller and smaller and smaller. Eventually, the furnace was no more than a point of light. Then it detonated like a supernova. The shockwave of the explosion rocked that section of space. Debris and destruction spread everywhere, far beyond what the eye could see. Dragon 1 and Dia Robber were sent flying away by that scary power. When Dragon 1 and Dia Robber gathered themselves enough to look around, they saw that the giant copper furnace had been reduced to nothing but cosmic dust. All of the swords from the furnace had cracked, because their hosting entity had been annihilated. They created a chain of explosions, one after another. It was like watching a giant universe firework event. Han Sen still stood there unaffected. Dragon 1 and Dia Robber looked at each other. This hadn't just been a display of high defense. Dollar had completely annihilated a creature that was almost deified. That was a very powerful attack, to say the least. Even a top-class half-deified couldn't endure the stream of swords like he had just done. Scary. Dragon 1 and Dia Robber thought of the same thing at the same time. Mutant Xenogenic King hunted. Core Smithy Furnace. Beast Soul gained. Han Sen was shocked. There had been no announcement of a xenogenic gene being found. Now Han Sen understood the scariest part of the coin's power. It had even destroyed the xenogenic gene inside the creature. That attack was the furnace's own power turned against it. The swords from the furnace were too powerful for it to withstand. Every power from the individual swords had been gathered together. Each one had probably reached deified level. And that was how Han Sen was able to defeat the furnace. Just as Han Sen was about to take a look at the beast soul the furnace had given him, he noticed something flashing far away. He looked closer, and he saw the small copper furnace running away. Han Sen stopped using his move mountain area and flew after it. The furnace wasn't a fast creature. It didn't fly quickly, and so Han Sun was able to catch up to it in no time. He pulled out his core demon bug gun to kill it. The small furnace stopped in its tracks, puffing its chimney to make the fire spin, spew and spread. It gave off a string of crying noises. Han Sun thought it was prepping itself to fight. He held the core demon bug gun with a fixed aim. But he soon noticed the furnace wasn't unleashing its green fire at Han Senator instead. The fire twisted in the air to form a few words. "My king, spare me." Han Sun was shocked. He lowered the gun, taking his finger off the trigger. The small furnace, noticing that Han Sun hadn't attacked, spit out a few more green flames. It formed the shape of more words. "I am willing to become your slave." Holy shit. This guy is very smart, Han Sun thought in shock. The xenogenics he had seen so far in the core area weren't intelligent. Even the deified insect wasn't smart like an ordinary high-level creature. But the small furnace's intelligence was the same as a high-level creature's. "What can you do for me?" Han Sun asked, looking at the furnace. Han Sun didn't think he could take a core xenogenic into the Geno universe. Even if he accepted its services, it would have to remain in the core area. The furnace understood Han Sun, so it spat out more green fire to shape words. "I can give directions to my king, for I am familiar with this place." "Pa!" Han Sun laughed. He thought the small furnace was very talented. "Wouldn't you hate me for killing your brethren?" Han Sun asked, raising an eyebrow at the small furnace. That big furnace looked like some sort of parental figure to the small furnace. It would be risky to have a servant who hated him. The small furnace spat out more fire and said, "We are of the same kind, but there is no connecting bloodline. If that is the case, then I will permit you to live. Go ahead and lead the way then. If you try anything funny, I'll kill you." Han Sun thought the small furnace was funny. He kind of liked the thing, so he couldn't bring himself to kill it. He would keep it around for now, and see whether or not it really wanted to give him good directions. If it really did want to serve him, then having a companion that knew about the core would be useful. In the future, he could avoid accidentally stepping into the territory of strong xenogenics. Having another mishap would be bad. "Do not worry, my king. I will lead the way. I will live for the king, and I will die for the king. I will spend my life in the service of the king." The small furnace spelled out, "Now I know you're full of shit. Lead me to where I can find xenogenics. Something I can kill that isn't so dangerous," Han Sun instructed firmly. "This way, my king." The small furnace led the way out into space. After the two disappeared, Dia Robber and Dragon 1 revealed themselves. They hadn't come out and greeted Han Sun before because he had been too scary. They had to think of a way they could motivate Han Sun to cooperate with them. He was so powerful. Unless they provided a lot of incentive, Dollar wouldn't care for their offers. And the two of them were fighting each other, anyway. Before they could offer him a larger portion of the reward, though, they would have to consult with their own people. "Brother Dragon 1, I have a suggestion. I am wondering if you are interested in hearing it." Dia Robber looked at Dragon 1. "Cooperation?" Dragon 1 asked, looking at Dia Robber. "You had the same thought, brother?" Dia Robber was surprised. Dragon 1 smiled. "It looks like we are a match for each other. We should go somewhere nice and discuss the details." "My thoughts exactly. After you, good sir." Dia Robber smiled. The furnace guided Han Sun forward. He was still suspicious about its help, but the small furnace didn't play any tricks. They went to a place with a small number of king xenogenics. They were creatures that Han Sun could kill easily. He managed to earn 20 xenogenic core genes in just a few days. He grew confident that he would find more xenogenics with the furnace than if he was to remain solo. Chapter 24:14. God Battle Ruin. Miss Mirror sat in front of her computer. She looked at the information on the screen, locked in deep thought. All the documents pertained to Han Senator. It was everything that had been recorded of him since the fight, when Kong Fei had snuffed out and relit a lantern. It informed her of everything he did, all the way up until he disguised himself as Bai Yi. The records of it were all there. Such a scary guy. These records make his life look like he's playing with cheat codes. He has done way too many unbelievable things. It is difficult to imagine that a leftover crystallizer, starting from scratch, achieved all that he has today. The investigation was very thorough. Miss Mirror had to admit that if she had been in the same situation as Han Sun, she wouldn't have been able to achieve half of what Han Sun had managed to. It is a shame that he isn't really Bai Yi. Otherwise, with his performance amongst the Extreme King, he might have become a legendary figure for us. Miss Mirror sighed. She turned off the computer and rubbed her temples. She had been tired for a while. The person who had her mirror spirit eye ring was disguising himself as a prince. It made things rather difficult for her. She couldn't tell King Bai about it, but neither could she lie to him. And King Bai wasn't an easy man to fool. Lying to him might lead her down a path she could never return from. Radio waves should be investigating Han Senator if they start uncovering his secrets too quickly. Things might go badly for me. And if I had Han Sun over, I'm afraid the mirror spirit, I won't be able to withstand the same dosage of damage again. Miss Mirror was beginning to develop a headache. Miss Mirror closed her eyes to think, but she couldn't figure out a solution that was perfect for her. A subordinate knocked at her door. Miss Mirror, the location of the 7568 God Battle Ruin has been confirmed. Give me the information. Miss Mirror sat up straight, looking like a lady again. The subordinate pushed open the door and set the documents down in front of her. Miss Mirror examined them for a while and frowned. She said, "Another race has been found? At Ruin 7568? Yes, my lady. Our people found a big excavation site, and some construction zones started up not too long ago," the subordinate explained. "Okay, that's all for now." Miss Mirror set the documents back down on the table. She closed her eyes and thought. A while later, she opened her eyes. She glanced over the pages again, then finally smiled. She said out loud, "Ruin 7568. If that is the one, perhaps I can convince my brother. I can take Han Sun there. This is an opportunity." For the first time in a while, things were going smoothly. Han Sun had the small furnace to show him the way, and he had collected many core xenogeneic genes. Now he was holding 4. He ate 2 and tossed the others to the furnace. It wasn't because Han Sun was a waster. It was just because he couldn't digest them. Even with Consume's help, he could only eat 2 a day. If he wanted to gain 100 King-class genes, it would take more than a month. Because the small furnace behaved well, Han Sun gave it a few core xenogeneic genes whenever he could. The small furnace was always delighted to receive them. Swords from the furnace required core xenogeneic genes for production. But core genes from different xenogeneics could create different swords inside the furnace. No wonder that big furnace was so strong. All the swords it produced came from King xenogeneic genes. I can't even guess how many King-class core xenogeneics it managed to kill in its time. Too bad the xenogeneic genes are melted down inside the furnace. If a furnace is destroyed, the swords are also destroyed. Otherwise, I'd have received enough xenogeneic genes to last me many lives over. Han Sun thought with regret. The small furnace followed Han Sun and collected a few treats on the way. When Han Sun left the core area, it didn't run off. It waited for Han Sun to come back. A few days later, the small furnace was forging a few sword blanks. Han Sun thought this relaxed schedule would last for some time. But when Miss Mirror showed up, she destroyed his delusions of just enjoying life for a while. "Pack your stuff, you have a mission to go on," Miss Mirror said before taking a sip of tea. "What mission?" Han Sun asked with trepidation. Miss Mirror had asked him to pack, so that meant he was leaving King's Kingdom. "This is your father's handwriting. Is there a problem?" Miss Mirror asked, setting a note down on the table as she spoke. "Yes. Can I bring my subordinates with me?" Han Sun asked. "I suppose you can, but are you sure about taking them someplace dangerous?" Miss Mirror looked like she was smiling, but she wasn't. Han Sun knew Miss Mirror was referring to Bauer. She was warning Han Sun not to attempt an escape. He wouldn't have a chance to. "If I can, I would like to bring Bauer," Han Sun said, pretending not to know what she meant. "Sure, but I have already told you. This place is dangerous. If something happens, don't blame your auntie for not warning you," Miss Mirror said. "I will be responsible for this decision," Han Sun said tonelessly. "Good. Go and prepare. We will be leaving tonight." With that, Miss Mirror turned and promptly left Underwater Town. Han Sun called for Bauer. He left the Blood Kirin behind in underwater town to look after Lan Haixin, just in case she decided to stir up trouble. Hansen wasn't planning an escape. The Extreme King were too powerful. Unless he had a reliable backup plan, he wouldn't flee. He couldn't go back to Planet Eclipse either. He didn't want to drag Isha into his problematic affairs. Hansen wanted to bring Bauer, because he didn't feel safe leaving her alone. Plus, he was used to having Bauer around. Whenever he was alone, it always felt like he was missing something. He asked the Blood Kirin to watch Lan Haixin. Lily begged Hansen to take her with him, but he refused. Miss Mirror had said that the place was dangerous, and Hansen didn't think she told him that just to scare him. He was bringing Bauer along, because she could protect herself. Lily was just a duke. She would be unable to protect herself, and bringing her would be like handing her a death sentence. He brought Bauer to the rally point, knowing that they wouldn't be going alone. Many members of Spring Rain had already gathered. There were many kings and half-deifieds. And Hansen even saw 2 fully deified warriors amongst them. What are they doing here? Hansen wondered. This was enough combat power to annihilate a higher race. When the ship started to move, Miss Mirror didn't come looking for him. Hansen had free time, so he practiced and consumed king-class genes. Hansen started trying to push Jadeskin's self-universe cogwheel. He wanted to get Jadeskin up to king class. That progress would be much easier than leveling up the Dongxian Sutra. It would only be a matter of time. The ship flew through many space teleportation points. When the ship arrived at their ultimate destination, Hansen was shocked. He knew the place. Isn't this the xenogenic space that Ningyu mentioned? Hansen wondered. Chapter 24:15. Stonefield. The xenogenic space was a very rocky landscape. The ships landed amidst an enormous field of stones, and the passengers of the ships made camp nearby. On Miss Mirror's orders, the Spring Rain members began digging into the stone field, unearthing even more rocks. Miss Mirror didn't instruct Hansen to do anything, other than telling him to stay in camp. While he didn't have to do any digging, his ability to wander around as he wished was limited. Hansen asked Miss Mirror what sort of place they had come to and what their mission was there. But she didn't answer him. She just told him that he would be safe as long as he stayed close, and he would be called for when the time came for him to work. This is the xenogenic space Ningyu described. Ningyu's little green sword came from one of the rocks that was found here. It looks like Miss Mirror's task here is the same as it was for the Hell. They want to excavate something out of all this stone, Hansen thought to himself. He really wanted to join the others in the stone field, so he could examine the rocks. But Miss Mirror was very firm that he shouldn't leave camp, so joining the others was out of the question. Instead, Hansen spent his time studying his geno-arts and absorbing king-class xenogenic genes. On their second day in the xenogenic space, something occurred in the stone fields. A few Spring Rain members had to be carried back to camp. When Hansen heard the commotion and came over to see, he found that the unfortunate individuals were turning into stone. Not long after, their entire bodies were fully petrified. They were just a bunch of statues. Miss Mirror and the 2 deified elites tried to stop the petrification process, but they could do nothing. None of their attempts even seemed to slow the transformation. After this, the work in the stone fields was brought to a halt. Although they were no longer digging, Miss Mirror showed no sign of wanting to leave. More ships arrived a few days later, bringing many different creatures to the camp. They were from a variety of different races, and all of them were marquises or dukes. They must have been brought there to become workers in the stone field. Ningyu. As Hansen watched the workers line up to register, he saw a pretty woman with pink armor. He recognized her as Ningyu, and he felt his eyes widen. Hansen was shocked. Not because Ningyu was now a woman. Hansen knew that little factoid already. It wasn't strange that Ningyu was actually there either. Ningyu would have been looking for a chance to come back, so he could find out what happened to his body. The Extreme King had recruited workers, so it was reasonable that Ningyu had joined their ranks. Hansen was simply surprised by what he wore. He had a little pink dress on, and he also had some pink earrings, rings, necklaces, and red flowers in his hair. He was like a pink lady, and he was genuinely pretty. If Hansen hadn't seen Ningyu before, he definitely wouldn't have been able to recognize him. Oh no! What is wrong with Ningyu? Even if his body turned into the body of a woman, it doesn't mean he has to dress up as one. Hansen thought to himself. The longer he watched Ningyu, the more convinced he became that something was deeply wrong. How to talk to Ningyu alone? Han-sun wanted to ask him what had happened, but he wasn't permitted to talk to the workers. Even if he could, everyone would be watching. There was nowhere they could discuss matters privately. Hansen thought about it overnight. And the next day, he barged into Miss Mirror's office. Miss Mirror, you brought me here. And yet you aren't letting me do anything. You won't let me out. And you won't even let me go on the internet. What is this? Han-sun demanded. My lady, we couldn't stop the prince. He just barged in. The guard said tensely, trying to explain his sudden intrusion. You guys can leave, Miss Mirror said in a cool voice. Her pretty eyes didn't even glance their way. Instead, she kept her focus fixed on the documents she was reading. After the guards closed the door, Han-sun said, even if you don't want to let me out, at least allow me to do something. If I'm stuck at home all day again, I am going to go crazy. And Bauer is just a kid. She can't remain cooped up all day either. You are the one who asked to bring her here. She is entirely your responsibility. Miss Mirror closed the file and looked at Han Sr. You will be given your task when the time comes. But for now, your job is just to wait patiently in camp. Fine. I can do that. But can you at least make nicer food? Plus, I want Bauer to have a maid to look after her. That isn't too much to ask, is it? Han-sun said. We are here to work. We aren't here on vacation. After a brief pause, Miss Mirror said, I will find you a maid. Now go home. That's better. Find a pretty one, though. It annoys me if the maid is ugly, Han-sun said. Are you looking for a maid? Or are you looking for a woman? Miss Mirror asked sternly. I am Prince 16. Is there something wrong with having a woman to please me? Han-sun smiled. Prince 16. Miss Mirror shot Han-sun a flat look. Han-sun coughed. I wasn't going to do anything. I just want someone to look after my kid. But you won't let me go out. And I must make myself look like more of a prince. Any other concerns you would like to share? Miss Mirror asked, fixing Han-sun with another unnerving stare. No, Han-sun answered. If there is nothing more you require, then go home. I have work to attend to, Miss Mirror said in clear dismissal. Then I'll go now. Please be considerate when picking a maid for me, Han-sun said. Miss Mirror stared at him until he left the office. I wonder if Miss Mirror will just pick a worker? If she picks a worker, I think Ningyu will have a high chance of being selected, Han-sun thought as he walked. It was all he could do after all. If Miss Mirror didn't pick a worker, then Han-sun would have to find another way to get some alone time with his target. The next day, after Han-sun opened the door to take Bauer to the canteen to eat, he saw a pretty extreme king woman standing directly before him. My prince, Miss Mirror asked me to serve you. The woman bowed to Han-sun, but her face was expressionless. Not bad. What's your name? Han-sun smiled at the woman. He had been prepared for this possibility, so he wasn't disappointed. If Miss Mirror had picked any random person, Han-sun would have grown suspicious. Falling Leaf, the woman answered. Falling Leaf, huh? Not bad. Not bad. Miss Mirror didn't disappoint me. Come, let's go find something to eat. Han-sun squinted slightly, lifting a smiling Bauer up to sit on his shoulder. Then the trio made their way to the canteen. While they ate, Han-sun turned to Bauer's new maid. Falling Leaf, your mission is to take care of Bauer. Satisfy all her desires. You cannot make her cry. Do you understand? Sure, Falling Leaf answered, her voice smooth and emotionless. Chapter 24:16. Jade Skin levels up to King Class. Han-sun had realized almost instantly that Falling Leaf wasn't an ordinary woman. She was very good at hiding her energy, so that the average person would be unable to discern her level. But Han-sun had his Dongxian area. There was no way that Falling Leaf could hide her King Class power from him. Although Han-sun couldn't tell how many tiers she had unlocked, she had definitely surpassed the first couple of tiers. Miss Mirror is very generous. Falling Leaf must be a ranking member in Spring Rain, Hansen thought, as he tried to come up with a way to make her leave. If Han-sun made her leave himself, that would draw unwanted attention. It would also give Miss Mirror a clue to figuring out what he really wanted. So Hansen couldn't take action himself. Instead of making her stay with them uncomfortable, and he would need to treat her nicely. Bauer, however, when it comes to making people miserable, Bauer is a true artist, Hansen thought, looking at his smiling daughter. Sister Falling Leaf, can you play a game with me? Bauer was holding a doll in front of Falling Leaf. Her big eyes made it look as if she was desperately begging. Of course I can, Falling Leaf replied, a smile softening her cold face. Falling Leaf was quite famous in spring rain. She was known as the icy femme fatale. Her calm, calculating mind made her an amazing assassin. When she worked, nothing could shake her up or throw her off her game. Her greatest fight took place on a deified-owned planet. She killed a half-deified elite, the son of a deified being, and they all backed off her. But facing a sweet little girl, even Falling Leaf's mood seemed a bit lighter. She seemed happier than when she faced Han-sun at least. Falling Leaf didn't know Han-sun was a fake prince, but even believing that Han-sun was a real royal, she wasn't interested in him. She would hate the thought of dating a prince. If not for Miss Mirror's order, she wouldn't have accepted the mission that brought her here. She most certainly wouldn't have agreed to serve Han Sr. Han-sun watched Bauer play with Falling Leaf and felt some relief. He returned to his room to continue practicing. After many attempts to turn Jadeskin's self-universe cogwheel, he was finally beginning to understand how it worked. He only needed to hit a breaking point for it to reach king class. Jadeskin was different from the Dongxian Sutra. Han-sun could actually see the Dongxian Sutra's self-cogwheel and all the other universal cogwheels around it. But when he used Jadeskin, the universal cogwheels all appeared blurry. They weren't as clear as they were with the Dongxian Sutra. So, Han-sun tried many different methods in the hope of turning the self-universe cogwheel. He had long since lost track of how many attempts he had made. The self-cogwheel refused to budge, however. He only needed enough power to connect with the self-cogwheel. Anyone could push universal cogwheels. And the number of cogwheels they could push all boiled down to how much strength they had. But ordinary kings couldn't actually see the universal cogwheels like Han-sun could. They could get a vague sense of what they needed to do, but they couldn't tell it was actually a cogwheel they were pushing. And although Han-sun had initially thought that the number of cogwheels someone had to push was directly related to their strength, that wasn't exactly true. There were some people who didn't push many universal cogwheels, but even so, they became very powerful. Many such people existed. The difficulty of reaching king class depended on the strength of the initial cogwheel. If the self-cogwheel was strong enough, and you cast sufficient power, you could spin your self-cogwheel very quickly. In so doing, you could equal the power of people who spun many cogwheels just by spinning your single cogwheel at high velocity. Many kings with one area power could unleash more power than kings with many area powers. That was the theory. Jadeskin was a Geno art that was very simple in the way its power was used. The self-cogwheel didn't have to push many neighboring universal cogwheels. But that didn't mean the self-cogwheel was weak in itself. When Han-sun was ready to become king class, he started off with Dongxian area. With Dongxian area's help, pushing other self-cogwheels was easier. The ability allowed Han-sun to see the Jadeskin cogwheel. Jadeskin's self-cogwheel wasn't much smaller than the Dongxian Sutra's self-cogwheel. After all, they were the self-cogwheels that were based on Han-sen's body, so there wouldn't be many differences between them. But the two cogwheels did look rather different. The Dongxian Sutra's cogwheel was black, while Jadeskin's was some sort of translucent jade. It connected to 7 universal cogwheels. That number was fairly ordinary for an average king. Compared to the Dongxian Sutra, that was a tiny number of connected cogs. But having a small number of connected cogs didn't mean that Jadeskin's power couldn't spread. The self-cogwheel would still spin very quickly. Under the Dongxian area, Han-sun slowly cast his Jadeskin, then began shoving against his self-cogwheel to spin it. The progress was now much easier than it had been when he was pushing the Dongxian Sutra's self-cogwheel. After all, Han-sun was king class now, so he had much more power that he could throw behind his efforts. Catcha! Catcha! The translucent jade cogwheel slowly started to shift. As the self-cogwheel spun, a weird flower symbol appeared on its surface. The flower symbol spread like a growing crystal, slowly sliding over the self-cogwheel. As the cogwheel spun, the symbol swelled more and more. A short time later, it had completely covered the cogwheel. Jadeskin's self-cogwheel became an ice moon. Jadeskin's self-cogwheel pushed the other 7 universal cogwheels that connected to it. As it did, the symbol glided over those universal cogwheels too. Then it spread further. The icy, jade-looking area power spread through Han's sun, becoming a strange sealing area. But after spreading for a while, the power returned. Heading back for Han's senator, his body absorbed all of the power. When the ice moon-like cogwheel spun, Han Sen's entire body crystallized, and he glowed like a crystal. He was like a god wrapped up in holy light. Boom! The cogwheel continued to spin as the universal core hall door opened. Han Sen's body was sucked into it. He entered the universal core hall. Han Sen didn't hesitate. He landed atop the cogwheels of the hall. And when the cogwheels moved, the hall's door opened. Han Sen exited the hall, finding himself in a new place inside the core area. This wasn't where he had been previously. Ordinarily, leaving the core area would set a spawn point for his return. He would be able to come back to the exact place he had previously left. But now that Han's sun was entering with his jadeskin cogwheel, it had taken him to a different location than where he would spawn with his Dongxian Sutra cogwheel. Does that mean I can go to different core areas with each skill? I just need to change the self-cogwheel to determine which place I access? Han Sun realized joyfully. Chapter 24:17. The Advantages of Gene Transference. Han Sun took a moment to look around, trying to place where he was within the core area. He wasn't in the mood to hunt core xenogeneics at the moment. After he had confirmed his location, he just returned to camp. Han Sun walked out of his private room, then suddenly jerked to a stop. Falling Leaf and Bauer were staring each other down. Falling Leaf's face meanwhile was covered in paper. She was holding 2 cards, and she looked very serious. Bauer, on the other hand, was holding 1 card. She looked gravely at Falling Leaf's 2 cards. Which one should I choose? Bauer wondered, carefully considering the decision. She pointed her finger, wavering between the 2 cards in the other woman's hand. It looked as if she had to pick one out of the 2. When Han Sun saw them, he knew Bauer and Falling Leaf were playing Old Man. Old Man was very simple to play. One of the jokers was removed from a normal deck of playing cards, and then the deck was dealt to the players. Each player then removed all the pairs they could from their hand. Once their hands only contained the cards that couldn't be paired, they took turns choosing cards from one another's hands. If a player chose a card that they could pair with one of their own cards, the player could discard the pair. The winner was whoever got rid of the joker, which could not be paired, and discarded all of their cards. This was a game that Han Sun had played a lot with Bauer in the past. Because Han Sun was very good at this sort of prediction game, Bauer initially never won. But after they played for a while, he stopped winning so often. Before long, Han Sun felt as if he would never win another game. It took a lot of focus for him to play with Bauer, especially when he was doing his best to avoid losing. Eventually, he just stopped playing with Bauer entirely, which meant Bauer could never exact revenge on Han Sun for all the times he had beaten her. Bauer had been angry about that for quite some time. But Han Sun was very adamant about not playing with her. He never gave her the chance to exact revenge on him. It was a game that was highly based on luck, judgment, observation, and mind tricks. The Han family prided themselves on their skill with the game. But Han Sun was no longer sure if he had what it took to beat Bauer these days. Seeing Falling Leaf with a face full of paper, he could tell she had lost badly. Bauer's face was very clean, and there was not a single piece of paper on her. As Bauer's hand moved slowly back and forth between the 2 cards, Falling Leaf's face displayed no emotion. But her heart leaped in her chest with every movement of Bauer's hand. She really did feel awful. In the beginning, she had only agreed to play the game with Bauer to make the child happy. A game like this was too easy for a killer like her. She was excellent at reading people, and her prediction abilities were phenomenal, of course. But in all the time since they had begun playing, she hadn't won once. Falling Leaf was rapidly growing rather desperate, and she would have done anything to win at least once. Falling Leaf's eyes stared at the 2 cards in her hands. Whenever Bauer touched the Joker card, she felt good. When she pointed at the 7 of Hearts, she felt very worried. Maybe I'll pick this one? Bauer said. Her little hand reached for the Joker card. Falling Leaf's pulse quickened as Bauer's fingers brushed the Joker card. Take it! Take it! Falling Leaf was shouting madly in her heart, but she didn't allow her emotions to show on her face. Suddenly Bauer stopped. She turned and grabbed the 7 of Hearts and she smiled. I think I am going to take this one. A muscle in Falling Leaf's cheek twitched. Her fingers tightened on the 2 cards as Bauer tried to pull the 7 of Hearts loose. Falling Leaf wouldn't let it go. Seeing that the woman was refusing to let the card go, Bauer didn't know what to do. She let go of the 7 of Hearts and picked the Joker card. In that case, I will take this one. Falling Leaf was thrilled, and she released her claw-like grip on the cards. Bauer grabbed the Joker card and quickly said, It is my turn. Bauer placed 2 cards in the deck, and then brought out 2 cards of her own. Facing Falling Leaf, she said, Okay, it is your turn to pick. Falling Leaf gritted her teeth and stared at the 2 cards. She focused intently, as if she could read something from the back of the cards. As the top killer in Spring Rain, Falling Leaf's powers of observation and judgment were the best. She could easily pick up on even the smallest difference. She had just taken the Joker card, so it was possible that some instinct deep within her would guide her to victory. But God only knew what material was used to create those cards. They were thin as paper, but she couldn't sense any trace that might identify the cards. She couldn't tell what was on the cards. Falling Leaf's eyes looked ready to pop out of her skull. She couldn't tell which one was the Joker card. Are you going to pick one or not? Bauer said with a yawn. What's the rush? Falling Leaf reached out her hand to pick the card that was on the left. She looked at Bauer, hoping to see some sort of clue in her eyes. If that's the one you want, then just take it, Bauer said, her face bored. Falling Leaf, hearing Bauer say this, decided not to pick it. They had only been together for 2 hours, but in Falling Leaf's eyes, Bauer was no longer a small child. Trying to fool me, huh? It's not that easy. Falling Leaf raised her hand to take the card on the right. When she turned it around, though, she looked like she had been struck by lightning. It was a Joker card. Why do you not just believe people? You adults are all so complicated. I don't understand you. Bauer looked sorrowful as she shook her head. Falling Leaf's face twitched. She gnashed her teeth and said nothing. She placed the card down behind her and drew 2 more cards. She put them in front of Bauer and coldly said, Your turn. I picked this one. Bauer reached out her hand and picked up the 7 of Hearts from Falling Leaf's hands. Haha, I win again. Bauer threw down her pair of 7s. She grabbed a piece of paper and stuck it on Falling Leaf's face. We're playing again. Falling Leaf started to shuffle the deck. I'm not playing. You are too weak for me. Bauer looked very bored. Just one last time, Falling Leaf said slowly, enunciating the words. Her eyes looked ready to burst into flames. Hansen almost laughed. Playing that game with Bauer was like a death wish. Bauer rolled her eyes, looking like she really had no interest in playing. She said, We can play, but sticking paper on each other's faces is boring. Let us raise the stakes. Sure. What would you like to bet? Falling Leaf really wanted to win. She was Spring Rain's top killer. She couldn't allow herself to lose to a kid. She had to win. The loser has to go to the door and shout, I am stupid, Bauer said after a moment of thought. That, Falling Leaf hesitated. She wasn't entirely sure she could defeat Bauer, and many Spring Rain elites were nearby. It would be embarrassing if she was heard. Never mind then. This is lame anyway. Bauer stood up and got ready to go. Fine. We will do as you say. Falling Leaf almost shouted as she touched Bauer's arm. She was desperate to defeat her. Hansen couldn't watch. The game had ended before it even began. Not even a deified being could beat Bauer at this game. This was what the Hansen family was best at. *endnote. When a person loses a round, they place a sticker on their face. This makes it obvious at a glance who is winning and who is losing. Chapter 24:18 Swapping Minds. While Miss Mirror was speaking with two of the four Spring Rain Kings, whose names were Red Cloud and Night Wind, a sound erupted from Han Sen's place, interrupting their discussion. "I am stupid," someone screamed. The three of them swapped strange glances. The voice undeniably belonged to Falling Leaf, but they couldn't believe Falling Leaf would ever yell those words. Aside from Miss Mirror and the four kings of Spring Rain, Falling Leaf was known as one of Spring Rain's best. She was a very cruel woman, but she worked hard. She was proud, violent, and always ready for a fight. How could those words pass through the mouth of someone like that? Was that who it sounded like? Night Wind turned to Red Cloud and Miss Mirror with a confused expression. "We'll end things here for now. You two can go home." Miss Mirror frowned. She stood up and went to Han Sen's place. She wanted to see what Han Sen was up to. A woman like Falling Leaf wasn't someone who could be forced to say anything of the sort. She would rather die than make that sort of admission. If Han Sen had used some trick to fool Falling Leaf, Miss Mirror wouldn't ignore such a transgression. She had sent Falling Leaf to look after Han Sen, but she wouldn't stand for the woman being bullied. "Why are you here?" Han Sen asked with a pleasant smile when he answered the door and saw Miss Mirror. "What did you do to Falling Leaf?" Miss Mirror frowned. "What did I do to her? I haven't spoken much with her. She's been playing with Bauer all this time. Go and take a look if you want to." Han Sen moved aside and gestured for her to enter. Miss Mirror didn't believe Han Senator. She walked through the entry and went into the living room. There she found Falling Leaf playing card games with Bauer. "Miss Mirror." Falling Leaf shot to her feet and bowed. "Are you okay?" Falling Leaf's forbidding face was covered in little stickers. The sight almost made Miss Mirror want to crack up in laughter. "I'm okay." Falling Leaf's face blushed deeply, but she didn't remove the pieces of paper stuck to her face. She was a killer, and killers always kept their word. She might have lost the game, but she wasn't going to disgrace the rules. "I'm glad to see you are okay." Miss Mirror looked at Han Sen and said in a hard voice, "Follow me." Han Sen shrugged and followed Miss Mirror into the garden. "You know, Falling Leaf is one of my people. You should be careful how you choose to treat her." Miss Mirror settled herself into one of the garden chairs and looked at Han Sen as she spoke. Han Sen laughed. "I haven't done a single thing to her. And I wouldn't want to do anything to offend her either. She is merely playing with Bauer. You can ask her if you don't believe me. It is good that you haven't mistreated her. I'm just warning you though. Don't do anything that will make her or me unhappy," Miss Mirror said in a firm voice. "Understood." Han Sen shrugged again. "Give me your hand." Miss Mirror was looking at the ring Han Sen wore, and her request came with a glimmer of hesitation. Although Han Sen wasn't a bad fighter, he was too low level. Miss Mirror didn't think Han Sen, with his current power, could be of much assistance to her. But since she was there, she knew it would be a good idea to get to know him a little better. The mind and the heart were inseparably linked, so the best way to learn someone's personality was through their mind. It was a very accurate way of reading people. "What are you doing?" Han Sen asked as he extended his right hand in front of Miss Mirror. "Are you playing dumb?" Miss Mirror stared at Han Sr. "Of course not. You should have just told me more clearly." Han Sen laughed and pulled back his right hand. He extended his left hand instead, the mirror spirit eye ring glinting on one of his fingers. Miss Mirror observed the mirror spirit eye ring, and a lump rose in her throat. Seeing the ring made her mind hearken back to the man who had once worn it. That man had been smart and gentle. Even now, thinking of that man made her heart leap. Miss Mirror never regretted marrying that man. Choosing him had been the most precious experience in her entire life. But God hadn't allowed her to be by his side forever. Thinking of that man would have made any woman's heart jump. And then seeing the current master of the ring, Miss Mirror could only sigh. Although Han Sen was good compared to that man, she thought he couldn't begin to compare. Miss Mirror reached out her hand and put her mirror spirit eye ring next to Han Sen's ring. Miss Mirror's face didn't possess supermodel-like beauty. She wasn't as hot as someone like Gu Qingqing certainly. She was more like a well-dressed and mature lady. But Miss Mirror's hands were too pretty to criticize. Every finger was long and slender. Her skin was white like jade, and her nails glittered like crystals. Her hands were lovely and elegant. Han Sen had seen many pretty women in his time, but this was the first time he had ever seen such beautiful hands. Miss Mirror's hand came closer to Han Sen, and the mirror spirit eye ring reacted. The emerald ring began to glow. When those two eye-like gems touched each other, Han Sen and Miss Mirror both shivered. They felt a strange power generate in the mirror spirit eye rings, and then the power went into both of their bodies. The energy traveled up their arms and straight into their brains. Han Sen's body vibrated. He looked around, finding himself in a place where it was raining. The springtime rain was falling as if God himself was crying. But when those tears fell, they watered everything around him. The trees, the flowers, the grass, the chestnuts. The rain soaked into all of them, and the sadness held within the rain provided a source of infinite life force and hope. Han Sen had studied the 48 water minds of Destiny's Tower, and the spring rain mind was one of them. Miss Mirror's mind was spring rain, but it wasn't focused on the rain itself. Han Sen felt the way her emotions shifted and swayed within her mind. Suddenly, he really admired this woman. This mind was professional and enduring. It was like the strongest a deified being could achieve. No wonder her organization is called Spring Rain. This mind can only be felt. It isn't something that could be explained. Achieving this sort of mind is very difficult. Miss Mirror is a very complicated, and even contradictory woman. I cannot judge her as I normally would another. As Han Sen observed and sensed the Spring Rain mind, he learned much from it. Miss Mirror's body shivered too. She felt a mind inside her consciousness. But that mind wasn't too strong or surprising. It didn't impress her much. Miss Mirror didn't take Han Sen's mind seriously, as she had only touched their rings together, so she could learn more about him. But when the presence of his mind began to expand, Miss Mirror was stunned. What Miss Mirror saw, in terms of Han Sen's mind, was something akin to a flower ready to open. The mere bud might not have been very impressive, but as she tried to understand, she peeled away the petals. But try as she might, she couldn't peel them all away. She couldn't get to the center of the flower, and that disturbed her. Chapter 24 19 Flowers Know the Sea. Miss Mirror hadn't thought Han Sen's mind was strong, and the unexpected depth of his consciousness struck her with confusion. It was as if she had received a mystery gift, and she had no idea who had delivered it or what it contained. After opening that special parcel, she only found another mystery box inside. She opened it layer by layer, but there never seemed to be an end. It didn't matter if the gift deep inside the layers of the package was good or bad. Opening a gift like this would make people angry. Luckily, Miss Mirror was a very patient person, so she didn't look annoyed. She peeled open Han Sen's mind layer by layer. But after doing this for a while, she still hadn't found what lay at its center. Not even God had enough patience to keep searching endlessly like that. After Miss Mirror peeled away all those layers, her inability to find the center was too much. She didn't like feeling this way. I want to see what resides in your mind, Miss Mirror thought in determination. Gathering herself, she leaned the full weight of her deified mind atop Han Sen's mind to try to crack it open. Spring rain destroyed flowers. Han Sen's will was like the center of a flower that was being forced open. One by one the petals fell, but when the place covered by the petals was finally revealed, she found that it was empty. It's only a shell, with nothing on the inside. Miss Mirror felt rather disappointed. Minds represented someone's personality and the way they felt things. Han Sen's mind was very strong on the outside, but its interior was hollow. Therefore, he couldn't be considered someone strong. Miss Mirror wanted to pull her mind back since she was done investigating, but suddenly she couldn't. She had opened Han Sen's mind using brute force. A normal mind would have been shattered by such an act. There shouldn't have been left a trace of that mind left. But Miss Mirror could still detect Han Sen's mind with her own will. That was unexpected. The mind moved. Miss Mirror's eyes lowered, and she looked at all of the petals across the floor. Every petal was like a crystal. They were scattered across the floor, but they weren't damaged. The will that Miss Mirror had detected invaded one of the petals, and as it did, Miss Mirror's eyes widened. She had only wanted to peel away the petals to see what was on the inside. She hadn't bothered to look at the petals themselves. The mind entered the petal, and suddenly, That consciousness was like a rolling, storm-shaken sea. It was as wide as a sky and as deep as an ocean. The mind was so rich that Miss Mirror staggered under the detailed sensation of it. Miss Mirror bent and picked up another petal. The will was like a mountain crashing down. It was like a pillar that held up the sky, never moving. If she was a novel, this man would be a grand saga. A man could define himself as a broken, sick, elderly man on his deathbed, or as the warrior who threw himself into the thick of battle when he was young. People only focused on results. Wins and losses determined all, and rarely did people pay attention to what led up to those places. People often failed to see the desperation and difficult times men have to face frequently. Endurance and bravery abound in the hearts of men. Everyone fails sometimes, but real men get up and keep going despite their losses. No matter what environment they are in or what happens to their bodies, the only thing that can't be changed is the wants and desires of their hearts. They want victory, with the determination to win is greater than anything. Han Sen's will didn't have a core, because real men have no end. Ambitions grew continually, stretching out beyond the reaches of space and time. Forward, forward, and forward again until their time of death. Han Sen wasn't looking to climb the highest mountains. He wanted to go further and higher. His ambitions had no end. Infinity went on forevermore. Miss Mirror didn't see the core of Han Sen's mind, but every petal was what Han Sen had experienced. There was anger, happiness, sadness, endurance, sensations of sea, and sky and earth. Perhaps one single mind didn't make Han Sen better than Miss Mirror. But by observing all of those petals and understanding them, Miss Mirror couldn't help but feel awed. Suddenly Miss Mirror raised her head. She realized she was trapped inside Han Sen's mind. His emotions were affecting her mood. I cannot stay in a place that bothers my heart, Miss Mirror said with an implacable face. She summoned her spring rain mind, wanting to destroy the mirror where Han Sen had sent his will. She didn't want her own will to be affected. 10,000 petals were destroyed by her mind, but Miss Mirror soon found out that when the petals were destroyed, they fell to the ground like seeds. New flowers then opened. No matter how Miss Mirror's mind raged, or how she tried to destroy Han Sen's will, the flowers grew. She couldn't destroy them, only spread them further. Why is this happening? Miss Mirror wondered, stupefied. She couldn't remain calm. She couldn't completely destroy Han Sen's mind. It was an impossible task. She was a deified elite. Her mind was one of the strongest in the whole of the Extreme King. And yet she couldn't deal with Han Sen, who just a meager king. She couldn't believe what was happening. Is his will really this strong? Miss Mirror examined at her will, where flowers were half opened. She looked at them strangely. Ding! Miss Mirror took a step back. She separated the two mirror spirit eye rings, and looked right at Han Senator. Miss Mirror discovered that her mind was melting quickly into Han Sen's body. Seconds later it was all gone. Even Miss Mirror could no longer feel it. The mirror spirit eye's mind that had been sent to Han Sen had been extinguished by him. Thank you, my lady. Han Sen opened his eyes and bowed before Miss Mirror. Miss Mirror's spring rain mind had allowed Han Sen to learn a lot, and he was very thankful for the opportunity. When Miss Mirror looked at Han Sen, her expression was inscrutable. She didn't say anything, and she merely departed. When she returned to her room, Miss Mirror used many methods to try to erase Han Sen's influence, but try as she might, she couldn't. It greatly annoyed Miss Mirror. Am I not as good as a mere king? Miss Mirror chewed her lip and tried to use her mind to erase the flowers that stood for Han Sen's mind. Her efforts were futile. Those mind flowers had taken a firm root inside her mind. No matter how she tried to destroy them, the roots remained. They could keep growing again and again. Flowers know the sea, half open and half hidden. Wildflowers kept burning. The wind blew, and the process started again. Miss Mirror's crew had been working in the stone fields for 5 days. And after that time passed, something weird happened. A worker dug up a rock that was the size of a mortar and pestle. A few words were engraved on the side of the rock. The two marquises that dug up the rock read the text, and all of a sudden, they became dukes. Miss Mirror went out to the stone field with Red Cloud, and brought the rock back to camp. After their second day examining the rock, The deified red cloud was reduced to king class overnight. Chapter 24:20 Stone Man. When Han's son reached the control room, Miss Mirror, Red Cloud, and Night Wind were there staring at the rock through a monitor. The stone had been locked inside a warehouse. No one was allowed to physically approach the warehouse though. Whenever any creature approached the stone, something strange would happen. A deified elite had suddenly been reduced to a king. That was something that had never happened before. Even Red Cloud didn't know what had happened to her. She hadn't been injured, and she hadn't felt anything invade her body. It was as if she had fallen asleep and gone back in time to a point before she had become deified. Although she still had a deified mind and senses, her physical power and prowess had dropped to king class. It was a very unusual phenomenon. Han's son heard what had happened, and when he looked at Red Cloud, he examined her carefully. He could see that Red Cloud's life force had significantly lowered. When he had looked at her previously, the cloudy appearance that had shrouded her power was now gone. He could see her life force clearly now. She was only a king, and she was weaker than falling leaf. What do you think? Miss Mirror asked Han's son, indicating the stone. Han's son looked at the stone displayed on the monitor, and he noticed that it looked like any ordinary block of stone. It was black, and it was roughly the size and shape of a man standing on his feet. It was only a rough shape though. There was no discernible face. The rough outline of limbs were connected to the body, so the stone was a single lump. It looked like something that might have been crudely hewn from a greater rock by primitive individuals with their primal tools. Han's son knew it couldn't have been constructed though. There was no evidence that it had been created by sentient beings. Even the symbols upon the stone man appeared to be naturally generated. They didn't look like carvings at all. Han's son observed it for a while, and he couldn't find anything unusual about it. He didn't know what any of the symbols upon it meant either. He had never seen them before, and they weren't like the Kingese, which he could understand by instinct. I cannot tell you anything just by looking at the video, Han's son answered. Do you want to go to the warehouse to take a look? Miss Mirror asked, glancing at Han Sr. If you guys can't determine anything about this stone, then I definitely won't be able to, Han's son said quickly. He wasn't really interested in taking an unnecessary risk. Even a deified had been reduced to king class overnight. Han's son didn't want to have his level lowered, especially since he had only just become king. Han's son's answer surprised Miss Mirror. She was silent for a moment, then said, This news has spread all across King's Kingdom. My brother told me to keep it here and figure out what it is exactly. That didn't surprise Han's senator if they sent it back to the Extreme King without figuring out what it was, or how to control it. The stone could end up draining the power of all the deified Extreme King. Han's son found the thought to be rather funny. Night Wind said, We don't know how effective this item is. We will have to use another creature to figure out the nature and effective radius of its ability. 16. Didn't you want to work? I will let you handle this, Miss Mirror said. Me? Han's son was shocked. This was too dangerous of an endeavor, so he had no intention of trying it out himself. He would just pick some workers to go for him. It was surprising that Miss Mirror was actually letting Han's son handle this though. You have a problem with that? Miss Mirror inquired. Nope. What people should I use though? Han's son asked. Choose some workers to go. There are many of them, but you can only select a maximum of 10 dukes. You can have 10 marquises too, Miss Mirror said. Sure, Han's son agreed. Then it is settled. Get to work, and I will await your good news. Miss Mirror smiled. Don't worry, my lady. I will not disappoint you, Han's son answered. When Han's son left, Night Wind said, My lady, is it suitable for Prince 16 to be the one to handle this? If something happens to him, what will we say to the king? I can handle that. Now Red Cloud has lost most of her power. You will have to be in charge of the stone field. Be careful, Miss Mirror said. Han's son went to the stone field and selected a few people, including Ningyu. Although it was only a test, who knew how dangerous it could turn out to be. Because Han's son needed to confirm how effective the stone was, he would have to send people close to the stone. The closer someone was, the more danger they would be in. Han's son planned to keep Ningyu as far away from the stone as possible. Hopefully, he wouldn't be affected by the stone. If the furthest person was affected, then everyone in the base was already in range of the stone. In that case, it wouldn't matter who was or wasn't participating in the tests. Han Sen put together his operation swiftly. He split his 20 nobles into 10 pairs, 1 marquis and 1 duke per team. He instructed each team to stand at a different distance from the stone. The closest team to the stone was inside the warehouse. The other teams were outside the warehouse. He spaced the teams out at regular intervals, positioning Ningyu far in the back. Then, all Han Sen needed to do was watch the changes unfold within the 10 teams. High-level members of Spring Rain observed the proceedings, making careful records of everything that happened. After a single night, something occurred to the team that was nearest the stone, but it was different from what had happened with Red Cloud. They didn't drop a level. Instead, they leveled up. The Marquis became a duke, and the duke became a king. It wasn't as much of a surprise as when Red Cloud was reduced to king class, but it was still shocking, all the same. Now everyone was curious if the stone could be used to level up beyond king. If they could use the stone to turn a king into a deified, that would be pretty wicked. Even if the stone couldn't level people up that far, bringing dukes up to king class was exceptional. If he could use those powers safely, and there were no adverse side effects, Han Sen thought he could raise a king-class army. That would be a force to be reckoned with. Han Sen didn't allow the 2 leveled-up people to leave their position. They remained inside the warehouse, waiting for more changes to occur. By the 3rd day, no further changes were observed in the 2 people in the warehouse. The second team outside had been affected though. Just like those of the first team, they had leveled up. Ever since that rock had been found, all the creatures that touched it leveled up once. Only Red Cloud had been knocked down a peg. Han Sen went to check out the 10 teams each and every day. He also had a chance to speak with Ningyu. Han Sen found the experience to be chilling though. Ningyu was really girly. It wasn't just his body anymore. His personality had changed too. Han Sen could scarcely believe that this was the Ningyu he used to know. Ningyu never used to be afraid of anything, but now he really was sensitive like a girl. I was affected by that sword. Han Sen would never forget Ningyu's face when he said that. It was like a woman that had just been married, but her husband was killed immediately after. He looked so desperate and helpless, he was pitiful. Chapter 24-21 Losing Control. Han Sen felt a chill. This was no longer funny. Ningyu's mental endurance was almost as good as Han Sen's. But Ningyu had been dramatically affected by the green sword. Han Sen didn't know what to do with the changes that were occurring. Ningyu's body, his genes, and even his personality had undergone a shift. Han Sen couldn't believe that Ningyu now dressed entirely in pink, and his personality had suddenly become so very sensitive. He was very cowardly now, and he had lost all of his decisiveness. He didn't look like Ningyu anymore. Han Sen even wondered if Ningyu's soul had been taken by a woman. What is up with this xenogenic space? Why are there so many weird things going on? Han Sen frowned, and he subconsciously stepped farther away from the stone. He did not want to end up like Ningyu. The excavation of the stone fields continued. It took another 7 or 8 days for something strange to happen again. Someone managed to dig up a big rock that was leaking blood and had a hand coming out of it. The hand managed to break free and kill a dozen workers. It didn't stop until Night Wind appeared and killed it. Han Sen's experiments were still going on too. 4 groups had been affected thus far. They had all leveled up once, but only by 1 level. They didn't level up after that, and no one else had leveled down either. Now that Han Sen could confirm the effective radius of the stone, he could mark out a danger zone around the warehouse. But he didn't call the 10 teams back in. They still remained in their places, continuing the test. For now, no one could be sure if the stone might begin acting differently. Either way, the experiment wasn't going to stop. Han Sen didn't enter the warehouse to look at the rock, but it seemed like the stone was benefiting everyone who got close to it. But after the one anomaly of what happened to Red Cloud, Han Sen wasn't going to risk being careless. Just like usual, Han Sen called the 10 teams over. After questioning them, he planned on going back to his room to eat with Bauer. But falling leaf informed Han Sun that Miss Mirror wanted to see him in her office. Miss Mirror has something important enough to call me in now. From what Han Sun could tell, the digging job was being shoved forward as fast as possible, and they kept encountering problems. Miss Mirror had gone to the stone fields on her own, so if she had come back seeking Han Sun, he surmised something must have happened. Han Sun went to Miss Mirror's office, as he was instructed to. He knocked and entered. When he saw Miss Mirror, his greeting died on his lips. "You." Miss Mirror had ended up like Red Cloud. She didn't have that scary, mysterious presence anymore. Her life force was weak. She was like a king now, that was certain. She was no longer deified. "Yes, I have become king class." Miss Mirror looked calm, but Han Sun could still see the profound sadness behind her eyes. It looked like downgrading from being a deified being had been quite the gut punch for Miss Mirror. He respected the strength of her mind, but even a strong person like her would be shaken like this. Han Sun went silent. Then he looked at Miss Mirror and asked, "What can I do?" He knew Miss Mirror wouldn't ask him to come and see her for no reason. There were also limits to what she would tell a fake prince like him. Miss Mirror's eyes were steady. "Reinforcements are on the way. It will take them 2 weeks to arrive, and we are losing control of what is happening here. It has escaped my grasp, and something even worse might soon occur." Han Sun's face looked glum. For a strong woman like Miss Mirror to make such a confession meant that things were really bad. It was almost unimaginable. Things must have been far worse than Han Sun himself expected. "Why don't we just stop digging for now and leave this place? We can wait for backup to get here," Han Sun suggested quietly. Miss Mirror shook her head. "It is too late. Before I left the stone field, we dug up another statue." Han Sun froze. "A second statue like the one in the warehouse?" he asked, staring at Miss Mirror. "It was different. This time, it was a genuine statue. It has 1,000 eyes and hands, and each eye has 4 pupils." When Miss Mirror spoke of it, her breathing quickened. Her emotions were clearly still unstable. "Because of that statue, you became king class?" Han Sun asked. Miss Mirror nodded, and then she shook her head. "Within half an hour after digging up the statue, I dropped from being deified. But Night Wind, who was inspecting the statue with me, was fine. The other workers were fine too. So, I cannot confirm that I fell because of the statue. In that case, we really should move. We should abandon these efforts, stop excavation, and get out of here," Han Sun said. Miss Mirror shook her head. "I told you it is too late. Look at my eyes." "What the hell happened to your eyes?" Han Sun demanded. When he looked closer into Miss Mirror's eyes, what he saw shocked him. Miss Mirror once had beautiful eyes that looked like phoenixes. Her pupils had been black, but now they were red. And furthermore, the pupils were split in half. The 4 red pupils were a deeply unsettling sight. "Are those pupils similar to the statues?" Han Sun asked. Miss Mirror nodded. "Everyone who saw the creature, including me and Night Wind, looked like this. If we stray too far from the statue, we'll act like addicts who need a fix. The further away from the statue we go, the stronger the feeling grows. Our desire to dig in the stone fields becomes irresistible. You have to keep digging to scratch that itch. The only way to satisfy the urge is to plow. It is the only thing that makes us feel better." Han Sun's face looked gloomy. Everything about this place was way too scary. Even deifieds were affected without knowing how or why. Han Sun couldn't ensure his own safety in that place. "What can I do for you?" Han Sun asked again. The situation was beyond everyone's control. He wasn't sure that he could be of any help. If he could have chosen, he would have left the xenogenic space. The further away he got, the better. Miss Mirror started to answer, but suddenly, the office's doors were banged open. Night Wind rushed in. Han Sun looked at Night Wind's eyes. His pupils had turned red, and he too had a case of the double trouble pupils. "What happened?" Miss Mirror asked, looking at Night Wind. "We unearthed stone doors in the stone field. They're huge, as if they lead to some giant ancient city," Night Wind explained in a strained voice. Chapter 24-22 Scarlet Eye. Night Wind's face was tight and worried, and he had also brought a video back with him. When that video was played, Han Sun understood Night Wind's expression. The beginning of the video showed a stone path, which must have been the road that had been dug up. Han Sen didn't know how they chose where to start digging, but it clearly wasn't a random decision. They had somehow figured out exactly where to start digging. The Hell had controlled large-scale dig sites. When Miss Mirror and her people arrived, they quickly reduced the scale of the operations. Now excavation was being conducted in 3 locations, and the one in the middle had to have been where they began. As the video went on, it revealed many complicated stone paths that branched off until the stone road opened up to reveal a large room. There, Han Sen found himself looking at the statue Miss Mirror had mentioned. It was 10 meters tall. It wasn't very big when compared to some of the statues Han Sen had seen before, but it was pitch black, and it had the same texture as the rocks around it. The statue featured a man sitting with his legs crossed. His arms were crossed as well, making an X shape. The eyes of the man were just as Miss Mirror had described. There were 2 pupils in each, and they were red. Behind the statue were many arms and hands. They formed together to create the large shape of a torch. Every hand also featured a red eye with 2 pupils. Looking at the statue was disconcerting. It was like there was an endless tide of weird eyes were staring out of the screen. Han Sen was only looking at them through the video, but even so, he got goosebumps. A chill passed over Miss Mirror and Night Wind as well. The video didn't hang around the statue for long. It moved forward, revealing something that was even more surprising. Beyond the statue, the stone path vanished into a cave. It was a rough hole that looked like it had been dug by bare hand or claws. The walls of the stone tunnel were smeared here and there with blood. Claws and talons were carved into the surface of the tunnel. As the video progressed, more and more blood was revealed. The blood slowly took over every surface, turning the black cave red. The sight made Han Sen's stomach crawl. That cave couldn't have been dug by hand, right? Han Sen couldn't help but ask. Although the Extreme King didn't give much respect to the workers, they only hired people who were at least marquises. Those people were considered strong within their own races. Their weapons might not have been legendary treasures, but they should have been decent. Even if they didn't bring their own tools, the Extreme King would have provided them with xenogenic treasures. They wouldn't have had to use their hands to dig that tunnel. But based on the marks and scratches left behind, the tunnel was obviously the work of claws and hands. It hadn't been dug out with tools. Miss Mirror and Night Wind looked at the video with perplexed stares. They didn't answer Han Sen's question. Han Sen knew it was true even without their confirmation though. He looked at the video for a bit longer, and he soon saw a dead marquise with the head of a cow. Instead of hands, there was only a twisted mass of gore at the end of the man's arms. Bits of bone protruded through the scraped flesh. Seeing this scene, Han Sen couldn't stop his imagination from replaying what had happened. The cow-headed man had dug frantically with his hands, injuring its fingers on the hard stone. And yet it didn't stop. It kept on digging and digging with frenzied energy. Eventually, the man's hands had been ground to nubs. He had bled out and died. The video didn't stop there, and the grisly sight replayed itself over and over. Han Sen saw more and more dead bodies scattered throughout the cave. They were all in the same position. They leaned forward, pressing their destroyed hands against the walls. Some had shredded their palms, whereas others were missing entire arms. Despite having died, they still maintained their digging positions. Their faces looked very passionate, as if they were excited about what they were doing. But amidst that passion, there was also the presence of fear. It was a terror that lay deep in their bones. Han Sen couldn't explain all the emotions he saw etched across those dead faces, but his stomach clenched, and a cold sweat beaded across his back. The eyes of the dead workers were all open, exposing their dual red pupils. The stone path was no longer really a path. It was like a long grave dug out with blood. So many dukes and marquises had died up and down that stone path. And the further the path went, the worse the sights were. At the end of the video was a stone door. Just as Night Wind said, the double door looked like the entrance to a city. Both sides of the door were crimson, like they'd been made of solidified blood. There were also many semicircular marks across the door, scrapes left behind by fingernails. The door was 10 meters high, and because they had dug right up to the surface of the door, only rocks surrounded the doorframe. It was impossible to see what was beyond those doors. But what lay before the door gave Hansen chills. Many of the workers were stretched out before the door, like people trying to escape from the demons of hell. Their dead arms were extended painfully in front of them, trying to reach some non-existent salvation. Their nails were broken, and their bones were chipped. The blood on their hands had dyed the door, but none of them had been able to open the door. The workers had lasted so long, but they had all died before this door. Blood pooled around the bodies before the evil door. The door stood solid and unmoving, like the entrance to hell itself. Night Wind's face looked terrible. They are all dead. No one is left alive, and they had all gone insane by the end. They just kept digging and digging. Those rocks are hard, and they are incredibly difficult to dig, even with tools. When they used their fingers to dig, they began bleeding quite quickly. But when the blood touched the stone, it was almost as if the stone softened. They could dig it up, but it still hurt them. They kept digging until they bled out. Night Wind's voice trembled, even though he was a deified that had witnessed many life and death scenarios. What he had seen would give even him nightmares. This place is cursed. Hansen felt sick. He had the urge to just grab Bauer and flee. Although they had the red bird with them, there was something that was simply wrong about this place. Even Miss Mirror, who was a strong deified, had been affected. There was every chance the red bird might not escape whatever power was doing these horrible things. Run! We must run! We cannot stay in this horrible place any longer, Hansen decided. He was going to leave this place, no matter what. He would leave, even if Miss Mirror sought to stop him. Your eyes! Miss Mirror suddenly whispered in dread, looking at Hansen's eyes. Fear filled her face. What happened to my eyes? Hansen's heart jumped. He knew this was bad. With no hesitation, Hansen waved his hand to cast a water mirror, so he could look at himself. At that moment, Hansen felt like fear had sunk deep into his bones. His black eyes had turned red, and furthermore, a fissure was running down the center of each pupil. The circular pupils became gourd-shaped, and they were slowly splitting in half. Chapter 24-23 Contagion. I've been infected with whatever this is. Hansen realized grimly, and a stark chill rolled through his body. He had no idea how or when he contracted this creepy condition. Until Miss Mirror pointed it out. He hadn't even realized that the strange power had managed to sneak into his body and infect his eyes. Miss Mirror and Night Wind stared at him in astonishment. Hansen had never visited the stone path, nor had he looked at the statue with 1,000 eyes in person. But now, there was no denying that each of his eyes had 2 red pupils. That could only mean one thing. The power was contagious. If it really was contagious, then that meant it was game over for every person in their camp. Even the reinforcements heading their way would be at risk. Hansen reacted instantly. He turned around and ran out of the office. Then he grabbed the guard outside and peered deeply into the man's eyes. The guard was about to shake him loose, but Miss Mirror and Night Wind came out to stop him. His pupils haven't changed. Hansen looked into the eyes of a few more guards. Their eyes were perfectly normal. The next second, Hansen pulled out his phone and called Falling Leaf's number. It rang twice, and then Falling Leaf picked up the phone. She only answered the voice call though, so there was no video. Falling Leaf, is Bauer nearby? Hansen asked. Yes, Falling Leaf answered. Turn on your video chat, Hansen said. Why? Falling Leaf asked without turning on the video. Just do what he told you to, Miss Mirror said. Okay, Falling Leaf answered. She turned on her video chat, and her image appeared on Hansen's screen. Falling Leaf's hair was a bit messy, and her clothing was misbuttoned. Hansen had no idea what she had been doing with Bauer all alone. But that wasn't important. Hansen stared at her pupils and noticed they were normal. The colors were still the same, and there was only one pupil in each eye. Hansen sagged a little in relief. Dad! Bauer was sitting on the sofa, holding a pair of dice in her hands. Her voice sounded so sweet as she called out to Hans. Senator Bauer's eyes looked normal. That made him feel even safer. Bauer, stay in the room and play with Falling Leaf. Don't go anywhere, and wait for me there, okay? Sure, Dad. Bauer nodded. Han Sun turned his attention back to Falling Leaf. Falling Leaf, keep the door shut and don't go anywhere. Don't let anyone in either, unless it is me. Falling Leaf didn't answer. She looked at Miss Mirror, who was still standing next to Han Sr. Do as he says, Miss Mirror said calmly. Sure. Falling Leaf nodded in agreement. Han Sun turned off the phone and spoke to Miss Mirror. Find someone with unchanged eyes. We need to conduct a test. Miss Mirror looked at Night Wind. Night Wind vanished without a word. A short time later, Night Wind reappeared in the office again, pushing two people in front of him. They were two of the workers that Han Sun had positioned within range of the stone statue. One of them was Ningyu, and the other was the man he had been teamed with. Because Ningyu had been farthest from the warehouse, he and his partner were the first people that Night Wind had run into. You stay here. Han Sun pushed Ningyu out the door of the office and closed it. He pulled the Duke before the computer and restarted the video. He made sure that the Duke watched the entire thing. Han Sun, Miss Mirror, and Night Wind stared into the Duke's eyes. After the Duke saw the statue with 1,000 eyes and 1,000 arms, the man's pupils soon began to turn red. Seconds later, the color had deepened to a rich scarlet. Then the pupils started to split. In minutes, the Duke had red eyes just like Han. Senator Han Sun didn't need to say anything. They all understood what was happening. Merely looking at the videotape containing an image of that statue could infect them with whatever cursed power that structure contained. Han Sun opened the door and let Ningyu inside the room. His eyes were still fine, and there were no new changes there. He was able to confirm that when Han Sun asked, "No matter how you see that statue, you will be infected by its power." Han Sun frowned. He used a few of his powers to explore his own eyes and figure out why they had changed. But there was nothing he could learn. As far as Han Sun could stretch his senses, the eyes felt normal. They didn't seem to be under the influence of any foreign power. Even the Dongxian area couldn't determine what had happened to his eyes. It was like his eyes were the same as usual, but Han Sun could feel the same urges that Miss Mirror had described. He had a sudden impulse to head for the stone field. It was like an old smoker who hadn't smoked all day. He desperately wanted to go out and buy a pack. Luckily, Han Sun had a stable mind. He was able to resist the impulse. If his mind had been weak, he would have run into the fields already. The Duke screamed. His eyes turned red, and he started to gasp. He made an unnatural swallowing sound, then turned to rush out of the office. Night Wind grabbed the Duke and pinned him to the ground. He used a substance chain to keep him locked in place. The Duke fought like mad as he tried to shake the substance chain loose. His entire body shook like a junkie in need of a fix. His tears and snot began to drip onto the floor. What do we do? Han Sun asked, looking at Miss Mirror and Night Wind. Things were going bad very quickly, and this wasn't something they could run away from. Complaining about the situation would be useless. They had to figure out a way to get free of this mess. Maybe our answers lie beyond those stone doors. We might have to go there to find a solution to our current problems, Night Wind said. Have you tried destroying the statue with 1,000 eyes and 1,000 hands? Han Sun asked. I have tried to break it, but I was unsuccessful. That statue is harder than the average black rock. Our powers cannot damage it, Night Wind said. It looks like the stone door is the only way for us to proceed, then. The urges are getting stronger, and even with our powerful wills, we won't last forever. We can't wait for the reinforcements to get here. Let's head to the doors while we still have control of ourselves. When Miss Mirror made the decision, she didn't sound hesitant. Her voice was firm and controlled. Sure. Let's go to that stone door and take a look. Han Sun nodded. He wanted to see the 1,000 hands and 1,000 eyes statue too. They didn't have any evidence that the infection could spread person to person if the video wasn't involved. But at this point, who knew how the infection might be transmitted? If Bauer and Ningyu caught whatever this was, that would be bad. Plus, Ningyu was already infected with something. It had become hard to tell if he was a man or a woman, and his personality had changed radically as well. The Ningyu that Han Sun had known was gone. Now that Miss Mirror had made her decision, she immediately took action. Han Sun, Night Wind, and that Duke followed her to the stone fields. Red Cloud had fallen to king class, so they left her behind at the camp. She hadn't seen the statue yet, so for the moment, her eyes remained normal. Instead of coming with them and putting herself at risk, Miss Mirror instructed her to take charge of the camp while they were gone. Chapter 24 Do God City. The stone path was exactly the same as the video depicted. It was unremarkable in the beginning, and Han Sun and the others reached the statue with 1,000 hands and 1,000 eyes. But Han Sun could clearly feel that the closer he got to the statue, the stronger the strange impulses became. When Han Sun laid his own eyes on the disturbing statue, the feeling was strong enough to make even him shake. As the countless eyes seemed to examine him, Han Sun felt as if a ghost was actually staring at him. The feeling was 100 times greater than what he felt when he had watched the video. It felt like an endless stream of ghosts was going to come right out of the hands to devour him. Han Sun activated his purple eye butterfly, hoping to view the secrets behind the statue. The purple pupil claimed Han Sun's eye, becoming 4 spinning petals. Han Sun took a deep breath and turned his gaze on the statue. At that moment, Han Sun felt like he was seeing a demon from hell itself. Before he got a good look at it, pain lanced through his right eye. A wet feeling slicked over his palms, as if his hands were covered in blood. Han Sun's face changed. He forced himself to continue looking at the statue, but then he realized that the sight was about to blind him. He jerked his gaze away, not daring to turn back toward the statue with his purple eye butterfly still activated. "Are you okay?" Miss Mirror and Night Wind looked at Han Sr. "I used a trick of the eyes to look at the statue, but it almost blinded me." Han Sun lowered his hands, which he had used to cover his face. His eyes were red and dripping with bloody tears. Luckily, Han Sun's blood was crystallized. Otherwise, he would have lost so much blood that he would have died. "Stop looking. And don't use your eye skill to examine it again. If my guess is correct, this statue is related to some sort of eye god. Its powers are directly linked to vision. If you use an eye skill to look at it, that's like asking for death," Night Wind said. Han Sun nodded and remained silent. He followed Miss Mirror down the path. After moving around the statue, they came to the stone cave that had been smeared with blood. It looked just as it had in the video, with more blood and gore appearing the farther they walked. Eventually, they found the door at the end of the cavern. The Duke that was bound by substance chains screamed again. He tried his hardest to rush to the stone door. If Night Wind hadn't held the Duke back, he would have smashed into the door hard enough to burst open his own skull. The stone door was shut tight, and they had no idea what lay beyond it. Han Sun didn't dare to use his purple eye butterfly again, though, so he had to inspect it with his own eyesight. The urge to go to the stone door had grown stronger. But luckily, the 3 of them had strong wills. They wouldn't lose control of themselves like the Duke. But the urges grew stronger as time went by, and it was only a matter of time until their wills snapped. It would take a god to hold back these impulses forever. The stone door had no lock or handle. It was shut tightly, almost seamlessly, and that was that. Countless Dukes had tried to dig into it to no avail. The door had been impervious to their physical attacks. Night Wind and Miss Mirror swapped glances, and then Night Wind started to gather up power. They wanted to follow their original plan of forcing the stone door open. Han Sun stood next to Miss Mirror. His right eye was still red and swollen, and occasional sharp jabs of pain still radiated from it. Night Wind moved his substance chain, which hovered over the ground like a black sheet. Answering his call, it slipped into his hand and manifested as a black sword. When Han Sun saw the sword that Night Wind was holding, he noted that it gave him the same feeling as looking at an empty night sky. The powers it contained were unpredictable. Night Wind's eyes froze. The black sword in his hand struck the middle of the stone door, and the swirling darkness slammed against the door's surface like a dark horizon touching the ground. He struck the door repeatedly with the full force of his substance chain, but every time the darkness came in contact with the door, the darkness shattered like a crashing wave. All the while, the stone door refused to budge. Night Wind's power could incinerate an entire planet, but the door seemed unaffected. The rocks around were all broken by the dark blade, revealing the edges of the doorframe, but the door did not open. They could, however, now glimpse what surrounded the door beyond the doorframe. The door was set into a city tower. The city tower was built with black bricks. The bricks looked a lot like the black stone that was everywhere in the tunnel, but they were much harder. Even Nightwind's chain power could only leave scrapes across them. The scrapes he left behind looked like cat scratches. As the power of Nightwind's sword tore away more of the black rocks surrounding the door, Hansun saw 3 words engraved above the door. Hansun recognized those 3 words. They were written in the common language of the universe. Do God City. Do God City. This is Do God City. Nightwind screamed. Even Miss Mirror looked dumbfounded. What is Do God City? Hansun asked Nightwind. He had never heard of this place before. Nightwind's emotions had risen until he was almost hysterical. He lost all the composure a deified individual should have carried, but he didn't seem to notice. His eyes blazed as he stared at the 3 words above the door. The legends say that the ancient god had a powerful city in ancient times. That place was called Do God City, because the people of the ancient god were born deified. They couldn't level up further. Those who went to Do God City, however, often had the opportunity to rise above the deified level. All this time, everyone thought it was just a legend. No one could confirm that Do God City actually existed. If this is the real Do God City of the ancient god, then that explains why so many weird things have happened to us. And perhaps there is a chance for us to become stronger here. Nightwind looked at the door very excitedly. He seemed to have forgotten the danger that they were in. Hansun couldn't blame Nightwind for his elation though. Even when Sacred had been in power, not many elites had been able to reach the last step. Even the horrendously powerful ancient water god hadn't been able to rise above his deified status. Instead, he ended up as blood rain that moisturized the world. For the vast majority of deified elites, going through the Geno Hall to become a god spirit had a practically microscopic chance of success. If Do God City was a method in which one could become a god spirit, that would be tempting for any deified. Deified elites were still just people and they could get sick and die. They were not immortal. Even Sacred Leader had been searching for the key to immortality. It was natural for deified elites to want this. If Do God City can turn people into god spirits, then Ancient God wouldn't be one of the 3 most powerful races, Hansun said with a frown. Miss Mirror looked at the 3 words and said, Do God City is just a legend. This city has the words Do God City written on it, but there's no proof that it's actually the city of our legends. If it was the real Do God City, why would it be buried here? We need to think about this. We need to be careful. Chapter 24-25 Broken City. We can't get into the city. Talking about it is useless, Hansun said, looking at the undamaged city door. Nightwind's power was strong, and it far exceeded Hansun's capabilities. Hansun didn't stand a chance of opening Do God City's door if Nightwind had failed, and Miss Mirror had fallen to King class. They really didn't seem to have any options. Nightwind's heart jumped. His sword of darkness slashed again, but this time, he wasn't targeting the door itself. He turned his attention to the rocks all around, planning to dig out the entire tower that the door was set into. Hansun and Miss Mirror stepped back and watched. Since the door was impassable, they couldn't think of any alternatives. Nightwind's plan was a desperate last-ditch effort, not a well-thought-out strategy. The dark substance chains kept whipping into the black rocks, and the rocks were shattered and swept away. More and more sections of the tower were revealed. Hansun didn't know how many floors the tower had once possessed, and that was because the tower had actually been cut in half. It looked like the whole building had been slashed by an enormous sword. The stone pillars in the front were all chopped off. The pillars fell smoothly from tall to short, as if it had been a very tidy cut. The stone pillars were thicker than a water tank. There were multiple lines of pillars, and each line contained a dozen of them. The 3 of them stared up at the broken tower with wide eyes. Nightwind wasn't one of the top deified in the universe, but he wasn't weak by any measurement. Attacks backed by his full deified power were only able to leave small scratches on the city's bricks. Cutting a single brick would be far beyond his abilities. With that in mind, it was difficult to imagine the sort of power that would have been required to cut clean through this entire tower. Even thinking about it was frightening. In the beginning, Han Sen wasn't very hopeful that they would be able to enter Do God City from above. Surely such a large and powerful city would have some sort of bysema or restrictive power in place. This wasn't the sort of place that you could just climb over a wall to get into. But now, the tower was broken, and the restrictive properties of the place must have long been abandoned. That meant gaining access would be easier than Han Sen had imagined. The upper half of the city tower was missing. Night wind slashed the rocks in various directions, but he couldn't find the other half of the tower. The bottom half of the tower was filled with rubble, and so Night Wind swung his dark substance chain. He moved the stones out of the way, clearing a path so the three of them could enter the tower. There was little to see in the half of the tower that remained. A statue had once stood in the tower, but the upper half had been sliced through and taken away with the top half of the tower. The part of the statue that remained appeared to be sitting, and its legs were crossed. The three of them couldn't tell what sort of statue it might have been originally. The shattered remnants of stone beasts lay scattered around the statue. They had fallen, breaking across the floor. Judging by where they now lay, it was clear that they had once stood guard on either side of the statue. It looks like a pretty savage battle was once fought here. But if that is true, how come we haven't found the corpses of the creatures that must have died here? Han Sen asked with a confused tone of voice. Maybe we have. We've dug up a few severed arms, remember? Those limbs were ridiculously dangerous. Even once they had been amputated, the arms still managed to kill many of our workers. That certainly shows how scary the people involved in this battle must have been. Even their limbs possess indestructible power, Night Wind said. Miss Mirror frowned. She looked toward Do God City and said, "If this is really Do God City, then this must be the sacred place for the ancient god. Even the Extreme King have believed that Do God City was just a legend, not a real place that actually existed. The ancient god have protected this city very seriously. If other creatures wished to attack Do God City, then the ancient god surely would have fought back. But I've never heard any stories of the ancient god having a battle on this scale." After pausing, Miss Mirror said, "Based on what we're seeing, this is a ruin of a god spirit's battleground, probably from the very first era. How did the ancient god claim it? The ancient god might have the word god in their title, but they are not actually gods. Maybe we're making assumptions about what happened here. This might not be the ruins of a god spirit's battleground," Night Wind said. "Even if this isn't, a fight like this must have shocked the entire universe. There is no way no one knows about this." Miss Mirror shook her head. Han Sen thought and said, "Maybe Do God City really did exist, and it was just a forbidden place that was sacred to the ancient god. But this city was already destroyed in the very first era. Maybe that is why no one has actually seen Do God City. Maybe the ancient god themselves don't even know where to find it." "That is possible. The ancient god and the very high are always so secretive and mysterious. Those two races already existed back in the sacred era, and they were already very powerful. But they were suppressed by sacred back then. They weren't as famous as they are right now." Miss Mirror nodded in thought. If Do God City already existed in the era of the gods, and it was destroyed at some point afterward, does that mean there are secrets here that are associated with what it takes to become a god? Night Wind sounded very excited. Han Sen shook his head. "Maybe not. For Do God City to be destroyed like this, it probably means that the ancient god failed. Maybe the secret inside Do God City was already stolen? This might just be an empty city now." Night Wind understood this line of reasoning, but he still held hopes of plundering Do God City. He said, "No way. There must be something inside this city. Otherwise, why are other powers trying to fight their way into the city?" "It's hard to say," Han Sen said quietly. In truth, Han Sen also thought that there was something inside Do God City. But that item could be something very different from the secret to becoming a god. Perhaps some frightening people had survived the grand battle, and were now deliberately luring people inside. Han Sen had a bad feeling about this place. They had found a stone that could turn a deified into a king, and a statue that had 1,000 hands and 1,000 eyes. Whatever was inside this creepy place, it wouldn't be very nice. Let's head inside for now, Miss Mirror told Night Wind. Night Wind went back to breaking up and hauling out the rubble. The whole of Dew God City was buried under an avalanche of stone. Even the structures and streets were all buried by rock. If Night Wind and the others wanted to proceed, they would have to move the stones. Luckily, all the rocks in the city had already been reduced to shattered rubble. There weren't big chunks like what they had found outside the door. Because of that, they didn't need tools to break up the rocks into smaller chunks. They just had to haul out the shattered stones. With Night Wind's powers, moving mountains wouldn't have been difficult, so hauling away some rubble was really easy. He didn't dare use his power to remove all the rubble though. He was afraid of breaking something valuable buried under the stone. Also, on the chance that something was still alive and sleeping within the city, he didn't want to wake it up. After the experiences that they'd had in recent days, even a deified elite like Night Wind would treat Dew God City with an appropriate level of respect. He wouldn't attempt anything stupid. Night Wind guided his dark substance chains, sliding aside rocks that were 12 meters wide. After going past the tower, they found themselves in a plaza. Night Wind kept digging, removing 100 meters of stone before coming to a stop. He stared at the place he had just dug up. Chapter 24-26 Big Sword Hansun and Miss Mirror carefully followed Night Wind's gaze. Nearby, there was a big sword sticking partially out of the rubble. The sword's handle was 1 foot wide and 2 feet tall. They couldn't tell how long the blade was because the blade was plunged deep into the ground of the plaza. Only 80 centimeters of it could be seen. The sword was fairly rusty, and it was covered by a layer of gray film. A grim expression passed over Hansen's face as he looked at the weapon. It gave off a powerful murderous aura. The handle was shaped like a bamboo branch, and there was no actual handguard protecting it. The handle connected straight to the blade of the sword itself. It was double-edged, and there were strange symbols engraved down the center of the blade. They looked like snakes or vines or something. With so little of the blade visible, it was difficult to tell exactly what they were. Night Wind sensed something dangerous about this half-buried sword, which was why he had ceased digging. All he did was stare at it. Hansun could feel the power simmering from the sword. It was like there were 1,000 angry spirits struggling, twisting, and screaming within its blade. But when he looked closer, he couldn't actually detect anything threatening about the weapon. It was huge, but other than that, it was ordinary and covered in rust. Night Wind lifted his sword of darkness again and approached the big sword slowly. He was so careful that it looked like he was walking towards some sort of terrifying, deified elite, rather than a rusty sword plunged into the earth. Miss Mirror and Hansun stood back. They were now king class. If Night Wind couldn't handle this threat, there was nothing they could do to even the odds. Night Wind had to force himself to take every step. This entire place was just too weird, and there was something ominous about the way the sword was plunged into the ground. It was entirely possible that the sword harbored some mysterious, frightening power, like the 2 statues they had encountered. But thankfully, when Night Wind reached the sword, the weapon didn't react to his presence. Night Wind didn't touch the sword. He used a night substance chain to remove the rocks behind the sword. He dug another path around the sword, and the sword remained in place. Nothing happened. Miss Mirror frowned and studied the sword. She seemed to be considering their options. It looks like the sword isn't going to attack. It might just be a weapon that they left behind. Night Wind looked at the sword, his eyes flashing. If it really was a weapon from the era of the gods, then perhaps it was some relic that exceeded the strength of a deified weapon. "My lady, should I try to pick it up?" Night Wind asked, looking at Miss Mirror. Although Miss Mirror was king class now, Night Wind still really respected her. He wasn't going to speak disrespectfully to her or talk down to her because of her level. Whatever power drew us here, it isn't this. Let's not move it. Continue digging a way forward, Miss Mirror said quietly. Hansen's greedy personality usually drove him to take every piece of the treasure he could find. But in this place, not even he was willing to be careless. He agreed with what Miss Mirror said. It was best not to touch it for now. This place was cursed, so perhaps something fouler had yet to occur. But Night Wind disagreed. He thought for a moment and said, "If this is a weapon that was left behind during the battle between gods, perhaps it will help us search this city." There was some truth in Night Wind's words. If they could free the sword, they might be able to use it as a weapon. The sword must have been extremely powerful back in the day. If they could control the weapon, perhaps it could sort out many of the issues they had yet to face. For instance, the sword might be able to break the statue of 1,000 hands and 1,000 eyes. If they were able to do that, perhaps they could remove the red eye powers. If they could use the sword to remove their infection, then it wouldn't be necessary for them to keep exploring the city. Instead, they could merely wait until their reinforcements arrived. Miss Mirror was still a little hesitant. Whether they took the sword or not, both options had pros and cons. It was a gamble either way. Winning the bet would have fantastic rewards, but if they lost, it would make their situation even worse. Let's keep on going. Miss Mirror didn't allow Night Wind to touch the sword. If there was a gamble, they might be on the losing end. If they did not gamble, they would neither win nor lose. If the choice had been up to Han Sun, not even he would have tried his luck with that sword. It was far too risky, he believed. The most important reason he didn't want anything to do with the sword, though, was because of what had happened with Ningyu and the little green sword. The green sword had been much smaller, and it had turned Ningyu into someone who was neither a man nor a woman. If Han Sun grabbed that big sword, God only knew what might happen. Perhaps it would turn him into a eunuch. That was unthinkable. Although Ningyu was really girly, at least he still had a penis. Night Wind didn't insist though. It seemed as if he still acknowledged Miss Mirror's authority. Even though he held a different opinion, he didn't go against Miss Mirror's will. The three of them proceeded around the sword as Night Wind continued to remove the rubble from a path in front of them. As they went, Night Wind's excavation revealed many more gouges and deep slices that had been carved into the plaza. A sword mark was carved meters deep into the hard ground, paved with black stone. The black rock was amazingly sturdy, but it had been cut open like tofu. Pieces of the broken stone had flown everywhere, so it was scary to imagine how strong the wielder of that power must have been. These sword marks can't have been made by the person who left behind the big sword. Can they? I wonder who used it. As Han Sun observed the sword marks, he couldn't stop thinking about the buried sword. The woman dug up by the hell had only been deified like Night Wind. But when Night Wind's power struck the plaza, it barely left a scratch. Compared to the meters-deep clefts made by some ancient weapon, the difference was staggering. They were not on the same level. Miss Mirror and Night Wind were thinking along the same line, but they had already decided not to touch the sword. There was no reversing that decision now. Night Wind was leading them all forward when suddenly, a ding noise sounded. Night Wind's dark substance chains looked as if they had struck something, and they shattered into darkness. What did we find this time? Han Sun asked, moving to get a better view. The dark substance chains had broken against a stone wall, and despite hitting the wall with considerable force, the chains hadn't damaged it. The wall was covered with engravings, but since they could only see a small section of the wall, they couldn't tell what the engravings represented. Night Wind moved very fast as he cleared out the rubble around the wall. A short time later, the entire stone wall stood exposed before them. The wall looked like a floral screen, but it was much bigger than the average floral screen. It was 100 meters long and 3 meters high. Han Sun looked carefully at the carvings on the screen, and when he did, his face changed. Their eyes were drawn to the center of the screen. At first, they thought it was nothing, but when that section of the wall was viewed from the far left, the image resolved into something very strange. Chapter 24-27 pictures. There were pictures of the wall, and to Han Sun's surprise, they all looked humanoid. The figures had hands, legs, and heads, just like humans. Oddly though, they didn't have faces. Where there should have been noses, eyes, and mouths, there was empty space instead. They were blank and faceless men. Han Sun wasn't weirded out by the sight. After all, he had seen many kinds of weird creatures before. so a few carvings of faceless people wasn't enough to shake him up. The disturbing thing about the pictures was the scenes that they depicted. The 100-meter screen held 6 pictures. The first picture showed a broken city tower. In front of that tower stood a few men without faces. One of the faceless men was using a sword to attack the tower. That picture showed the backs of the faceless men. Their faces weren't visible. But when he thought about it some more, and took it all in as a whole, Han Sen's gut clenched and goosebumps flared up across his skin. Oh shit. These faceless people in the painting cannot be us, right? Han Sen stared at the first picture. He could only see the back of the faceless man who was cutting down the tower. But the scene reminded him strongly of when Night Wind had been clearing rocks from around the city tower. There were another 2 faceless men watching, and a 4th man was lying on the floor. That was obviously Han Sen, Miss Mirror, and the Duke they had brought with them. No matter how Han Sen looked at it, the picture seemed to represent their attempt to enter through the stone door. The people inside the carving were faceless, and their figures weren't terribly distinct, which was the only thing keeping Han Sen from fully confirming that his theory was correct. Han Sen and Miss Mirror looked at each other, then turned their attention to the second picture. The carving still featured 4 faceless figures with their backs turned. Not far from the figures, a sword was lodged in the ground. Han Sen didn't think that this picture required much interpretation. It was clearly depicting the moment that they had discovered the gigantic, rusty sword that had been stabbed into the ground. But the third picture, without a doubt, was them standing in front of the screen. 3 faceless men were examining the drawing on the screen. Only 1 faceless man was lying on the ground, and it really did look just like them. Who's playing this trick? Come on out. Night Wind shouted. His sword of darkness slashed repeatedly at the screen. Obviously, unless the person who created the pictures on the screen was a prophet, there was no way those carvings could have been drawn before their arrival. The only possibility was that someone had imbued that screen with some sort of power, and when they arrived there, it generated the scenes that were visible across the carving. Night Wind's dark substance chain struck the screen and shattered again, leaving no trace of their attack on the screen's surface. The screen was as hard as a deified treasure. Don't waste your energy. Let's look at the rest of the picture for now, Miss Mirror said. Night Wind's attacks were useless. He lowered his hands and joined them in examining the carvings. Han Sen understood what Miss Mirror meant. The third picture represented their current situation in front of the screen. But there were another 3 pictures. If the carvings were already carved prior to their arrival, then those 3 pictures might predict what would happen next. If the pictures failed to predict what was to happen, or if their predictions weren't accurate, it would prove that someone had been playing a trick on them. That would mean that the screen held no prophetic power, and they didn't have to be afraid of its contents. Han Sen looked at the 4th picture. The 4th picture still featured 4 faceless men, but they were now facing a tree. And this time, they didn't all have their backs turned. A faceless man lay on the floor, and 2 of the others had their backs turned, but the last faceless man was showing his faceless face. One of the faceless men with their backs turned clutched a sword. The sword was pierced through the faceless man that was facing the front of the picture. Blood ran down the blade. Is this predicting that we will kill each other? Han Sen wondered. Night Wind looked at the 4th picture and frowned. Miss Mirror had no reaction, and she merely moved on to look at the 5th carving. The 5th picture didn't contain 4 faceless men. There were only 3. One of them was lying on the ground, and the other 2 were in the process of strangling each other. From the picture, it seemed as if the faceless man on top was succeeding in suffocating the man below. That is rubbish, Night River grunted. This was a prediction that they would kill each other. Night Wind really thought someone had to be playing tricks on them, attempting to give them a scare. Again, Miss Mirror showed no reaction. She moved on to look at the final 6th picture. The 6th picture was even weirder. There were only 2 faceless men left. One of them was on the ground, and the other knelt with their hands folded as if in prayer. In front of the praying man, there was a statue with 1,000 hands and 1,000 eyes. It looked just like the statue they had seen before upon the stone path. Something must still be alive here. It's changing the pictures to mess with us, Night Wind growled, giving the pictures a look of disdain. Hansen knew why Night Wind was having such a strong reaction. He wasn't trying to point out how ridiculous the pictures were. He was just trying to prove his loyalty. Those 4 faceless men had no faces, and they couldn't be identified by their body shapes either. It was impossible to tell who was who, but the faceless man who held a sword had clearly attacked the others, and the duke they had brought with them was clearly the man lying on the ground in all the pictures. Only one of the figures in the pictures used a sword. Night Wind also used a sword, and he was good at sword skills. The faceless man who held the sword had to be him, and that was why he was dying to prove his loyalty to Miss Mirror. If what happened in the pictures came true, no matter who Night Wind attacked, things would go very badly for him. He didn't know that Hansen was a fake Prince 16. Killing Prince 16 or Miss Mirror, who was the king's right hand and sister, would have consequences that he didn't even want to consider. Deified beings were very strong, but compared to the combined might of the extreme king, a sole deified criminal was nothing. It doesn't matter if the person doing this is a god or a ghost. If he cannot come out, then that means he is scared of us. Night Wind, let's keep going, Miss Mirror said smoothly. Her pretty face was still serene. She didn't seem to care about the contents of the carving one bit. Hansen wasn't very concerned about it either. Just like Miss Mirror said, even if someone alive was actively altering the carvings, that person wasn't daring to attack them outright. Their unseen enemy had to be scared of something, and that made them feel a little safer. Chapter 24-28 Sleeping Place. Night Wind obeyed the command and deployed his substance chains to clear the rubble behind the screen. The 3 of them hauled their junkie duke along with them, moving around the screen and proceeding forward. Blood came from every orifice of the duke's body. He wasn't dead yet, but his prospects weren't looking good. That was especially true of his eyes. They had turned entirely red, and even the whites of his eyes had been consumed by the new color. Night Wind focused his attention on clearing the road ahead. After he cleared the path for some distance in front of them, he suddenly stopped. He looked at Miss Mirror and said, "Miss Mirror, should we change the direction of our travel?" "Why?" Miss Mirror asked Night Wind. Hansen was curious about this too. He had no clue why Night Wind had made this suggestion. Night Wind sighed and said, "The 3rd picture predicts that we will reach a tree, but comparing the height of the figures to the height of the tree in the picture, it suggests that the tree is very large. It would be 100 meters tall at least. Moving a tree like that out of our path could be difficult." Hansen understood Night Wind's rationale now. The 4th picture seemed to indicate that they'd encounter a tree, and that tree couldn't be moved. If they changed course ahead of time to avoid the tree, though, the prediction would be incorrect. If they avoided the tree successfully, that would suggest that it really had been someone messing with them. "Let's switch directions then." Miss Mirror nodded. With Miss Mirror's approval, Night Wind changed direction and resumed digging. If someone was trying to trick them, it would be easy for that person to guess their course, since they were digging in the direction that the power was drawing them. The source of that power was their destination after all. The mysterious trickster might have seen them, known where they would go, and then carved the pictures accordingly. If someone was rattled by those pictures, they would probably find some sense of security in following the road they had already intended to travel. And if they encountered that tree, they would be terrified. The trickster's plans would come together rather neatly in that case. Night Wind made this suggestion to keep that from happening. If the trickster tried to move the tree to intercept them, he was bound to leave behind some evidence of what he had done. The trickster's plan would fail. Night Wind moved quickly, digging at a very fast pace. After 10 minutes, they had followed Night Wind down a trench that was a few hundred meters long. But Night Wind suddenly came to a standstill. The rigidity in his back made it obvious that he had frozen mid-step, not just stopped for a breather. He stood there, staring ahead as if he had seen a ghost. He didn't even lower his raised arms. What happened? Hansen followed Night Wind's gaze. He saw that Night Wind had cleared half of the rocks, and a small object was now peeking out of the rubble. When Hansen saw what it was, his face paled as well. A twig was rising from the rocks, and several green leaves had sprouted from it. It looked like it belonged to a willow tree. "How?" Han-sun asked uncomfortably. He peered more closely at the twigs and leaves, and they looked like the ones in the picture. Night Wind silently used his dark substance chains to remove all the nearby rocks. More twigs appeared as the rubble was tossed away. A few minutes later, a mass of twigs and branches was showing. The whole tree had been unearthed. It was exactly the same as it appeared in the picture. It was 100 meters tall, and it looked like a willow tree. The flexible branches hung low, and the tree was covered with countless green leaves. The three of them stared glumly up at the tree. They had changed course in a way that should have been unpredictable, but they had found the tree anyway. It was way too weird. Han-sun inspected the roots of the tree. It was nestled in a flower bed made of stone, and rich soil covered its roots. It doesn't look as if someone moved it here, Miss Mirror said while looking at the flower bed. Maybe there are many trees like this. If that is the case, then we were bound to encounter at least one of them. This plaza is probably walled with trees. We would have found one no matter where we chose to dig, Han-sun said after a moment of thought. Right, Night Wind replied seriously, and he moved his substance chains to dig elsewhere. He wanted to see if another tree could be found in a different direction. Stop digging. There will not be another one of these trees. Miss Mirror waved her hands to stop him. Night Wind wasn't going to question Miss Mirror, but he did look at her with confusion. He was waiting for her to explain that declaration. Miss Mirror looked at the tree and said, I think this is a requiem tree. A requiem tree? When Night Wind heard that, he paled slightly. He looked at the tree with an expression of disbelief. Han-sun looked at Miss Mirror and Night Wind with confusion. He had never heard of a requiem tree before. Miss Mirror knew what Han-sun was wondering, and before he had a chance to ask, she explained. When I visited the ancient god, I saw a requiem tree once. The ancient gods say that these requiem trees are where their people go for their final slumber. The legends say that the ancient god need to be buried next to them, so that their souls can find eternal rest. If you've seen a tree like this amongst the ancient god, and now there is another one here, it doesn't sound like these things are terribly rare. Why would you say that there won't be another one of these trees around here somewhere? Han-sun asked, his brow furrowed. He was obviously missing something. I don't know how many requiem trees there are in the universe, but the one I saw before was only 2 feet tall, Miss Mirror said. The master of that requiem tree said they only grow to a height of about 3 feet anyway. Then they stop growing. If an ancient god dies and is buried beneath the requiem tree, it will absorb the ancient god's body. The tree will then grow 1 more foot, no more and no less. Do the math. If this tree has grown so high, how many ancient god bodies were here? Do you think there will be multiple trees that have reached this height? This is really a requiem tree? Han-sun stared up at the tree, suddenly seeing its prodigious height in a whole new light. Ancient water god's body had moisturized a few systems, bringing life to many planets, and even making primitive races level up. If Miss Mirror was speaking the truth, then that requiem tree must have absorbed a few hundred ancient god bodies at the least. It must have taken in an unbelievable amount of energy. It was hard to imagine how strong the tree must be, but Han-sun couldn't feel the appalling life force that should have been radiating from the tree. To him, it was little more than an ordinary plant. It is easy to determine whether or not it is a genuine requiem tree. If it is a requiem tree, the tree will have a requiem tree hole that holds ancient god powers. Miss Mirror walked around the tree, and it wasn't long before she came to a stop. She stared at one specific location on the trunk. Han-sun and Night Wind walked over to Miss Mirror. They followed Miss Mirror's gaze, and found her looking at a tree hole that was the size of a man's fist. The interior of the hole was jet black, and Han-sun's eyesight wasn't good enough to pierce the gloom and see if anything was inside. That is it. This is a requiem tree hole. I can't tell if a requiem tree egg is there though, Miss Mirror murmured to herself as she looked at the tree hole. Chapter 24-29 Requiem Tree Egg. Trees make babies? Is this requiem tree a xenogenic? Han-sun asked in confusion. Miss Mirror shook her head. I don't know if the requiem tree is a xenogenic, but it doesn't produce babies. The tree egg is essentially a collection of the tree's resin. The more energy a requiem tree takes in, the more resin it can produce. That resin gathers inside the tree hole to become an orb. It looks something like an ant egg. They are called tree eggs. I was told a story of a man who managed to get a requiem tree egg that was around the size of a fingernail. He was only a low-tier king, but he used the requiem tree egg's power to advance all the way to deified. Ever since then, requiem tree eggs have become the most sought-after treasure in the entire universe. But the ability of requiem tree eggs to help a king-class being rise to deified is only of secondary importance. People are more interested in them because they can be used to help deified individuals ascend. Miss Mirror paused and went on to say, but considering the battle that happened here, I'm afraid the requiem tree egg inside the tree hole has already been taken away. Maybe it's still here. Let me see, Night Wind said. Then he launched himself into the air and flew up to the tree hole. He hovered right in front of it, putting his eyes right near the tree hole to peer inside. This tree hole is strange. I'm looking right into it, but I cannot see anything inside, Night Wind said to Miss Mirror. Requiem trees are resting trees for the ancient god. They have unusual powers, so not even deified elites can see what is inside the tree hole. Luckily, requiem tree holes aren't dangerous. Just put your hand inside, Miss Mirror said. Night Wind hesitated, but he did as he was instructed. Just in case, he shrouded his hand in night power that would defend against anything evil that might have taken up residence inside the tree hole. Then he placed his hand into the hole. She said the tree hole wasn't dangerous, but who knew if some toxic bug had decided to make its home there or something. This entire city felt cursed, and so by Night Wind's reasoning, bizarre toxic bugs weren't out of the question. Seeing Night Wind place his hand in the hole, Han Sen felt nervous on his behalf. If there was something weird inside the tree hole, and it pulled Night Wind inside, that would actually be kind of scary. But after Night Wind plunged his hand into the hole, a grin crossed his face. He shouted, "There is something in here. It is circular, and it feels like a stone. I don't know if it is a requiem tree egg, however. Touch it with your hand. If it is a requiem tree egg, your hand will smell like resin," Miss Mirror said. Night Wind touched the item, and then pulled his hand out of the hole to sniff it. He didn't actually need to bring it up to his nose. Even at the bottom of the tree, Han Sen and Miss Mirror could smell that pleasant grassy fragrance. Just the smell alone was enough to make Han Sen feel like his body was waking up after a long winter. He felt so relaxed, it was like his cells were coming alive. Not bad. That is the smell of a requiem tree egg. I can barely believe that the requiem tree egg is still there. Pull it out, Miss Mirror said. Night Wind immediately reached into the hole again to pull the tree egg out. But when he tried to draw his arms back out, they stopped abruptly. He couldn't seem to get the egg out. The egg is too big. I can't get it to fit through the hole, Night Wind said. He pulled out his sword of darkness to slash the tree hole in an attempt to widen it. But when the sword of darkness hit the bark of the tree, it only left a small white scratch mark behind. There wasn't the faintest semblance of a firm dent. Trying to cut it is useless. The requiem tree is the resting place of many members of the ancient god. Even a tiny requiem tree is impervious to most powers and gear. And this tree is enormous, Miss Mirror said. Can he not crack the egg into pieces and bring them out like that? Han Sen said. The egg will be harder than the requiem tree itself. How is he supposed to break it? Miss Mirror rolled her eyes at Han's senator, then she turned to Night Wind again. How big is the tree egg? Very big, Night Wind said, his voice strangely distracted. How big is very big? Big like a brain? Han Sen asked with a laugh. A fingernail-sized requiem tree egg turned a king into a deified. If there was a brain-sized requiem tree egg, it would probably start a war that would consume the entire universe. If your brain is 1 meter across, then yes, it is sized like your brain, Night Wind said quietly. Han Sen noticed that the man's eyes were very wide. What? That large? Han Sen asked hoarsely. His eyes almost popped out of his skull. He could scarcely believe how big that was. Are you sure that is a requiem tree egg and not something else? Miss Mirror asked with shock. Not even she could believe it. No one had ever heard of such a giant requiem tree egg before. Even small eggs were considered priceless relics among deified elites, but this, the thought of a 1-meter-long requiem tree egg, was enough to make people's blood boil, and their hearts leap in their chests. The power of something like that was beyond imagining. I don't know. You should confirm it yourself, Miss Mirror. Night Wind came down from the tree hole. He still looked somewhat shell-shocked as he spoke to Miss Mirror. It was weird to see such an expression on Night Wind's face. But when seeing a requiem egg such as that, even a deified was bound to have difficulty managing their excitement. A requiem tree egg could strengthen deifieds. A requiem tree egg the size of a plum could increase a deified's level by quite a bit. If a deified refined a tree egg of this magnitude, they could easily become a god spirit. Miss Mirror flew up to the tree hole. She put her hand in and began feeling around the tree hole. Seconds later, her jaw hung slack in wonder. It really is a requiem tree egg. I cannot believe that such a large egg exists. Miss Mirror finally said after 10 minutes of fiddling. Her expression said that she wasn't entirely sure how she should feel. It really is a requiem tree egg, Han Sun and Night Wind said together. Yes, and it is also circular. It is somewhere between 1 meter and 2 meters across. Miss Mirror couldn't help but sigh. It is a shame that the tree hole is only the size of a fist. If it was a small requiem tree egg, we could take it out. Now we know that there is a tree egg inside, and that it is something that would change the universe as we know it. However, we don't have a way to remove it. Wait, maybe there's a way to get it out. Night Wind suddenly sounded exhilarated. What? You have a way to expand the tree hole? Han Sun looked at Night Wind. Miss Mirror looked at him as well, a single eyebrow raised. Instead of answering, Night Wind used his finger to point at the tree excitedly, and spoke. Look over there. Han Sun and Miss Mirror followed his finger. A deep scar ran across one side of the tree. It was a 3-foot-long gash, and it was 3 fingers deep at least. That is a sword mark. Han Sun's eyes brightened. The sword mark was old, and even though the tree had healed, there was a scar. But based on the angle of the scar, it looked as if it had been delivered by the big sword they had found earlier. Chapter 24:30 Taking the Sword. If we can grab that sword, maybe we can use it to widen the tree hole and retrieve the requiem tree egg, Night Wind said, his eyes bright with anticipation. That might actually work. Maybe someone or something wants us to go back and retrieve that sword, Han Sun said. The entire scenario seemed a little too convenient though. They had chosen to leave the sword behind on the road, despite what the pictures on the screen seemed to indicate. Now, they had been presented with a tantalizing prize that would force them to return and retrieve the sword after all. They seemed to be drifting slowly closer to the reality that the screen had predicted. I am willing to give it a try. I will go find the sword again and bring it back, Night Wind said to Miss Mirror. Go, but be careful, Miss Mirror said, her voice distracted and distant. Yes, I will get it done. Night Wind bowed, turned around and walked away. After taking a few steps, Night Wind stopped. He looked at the Duke. He thought for a moment and then said to Miss Mirror, My lady, this guy isn't going to make it. Why don't I put him out of his misery now? Han Sun knew what the man meant. Night Wind was obviously still scared about the prophetic pictures they had seen on the screen. If he got rid of the Duke, however, there'd be one less faceless man. That would mean the prophecy could be proven wrong, and it was nothing more than an illusion. Miss Mirror nodded. Night Wind picked up the Duke and left. Is it wise to let him go? Han Sun asked, looking at Miss Mirror. Han Sun thought that Miss Mirror and Night Wind knew more than they were saying. But Miss Mirror hadn't tried to stop Night Wind from leaving. That confused Han Senator. Miss Mirror didn't move, and her voice was chilly. You think he would stay if I forbade him from going? You mean, Night Wind will betray us for the requiem tree egg? Han Sun now understood what Miss Mirror was getting at. If she stopped Night Wind from getting the sword, and Night Wind wanted the requiem tree egg badly enough, what happened in the picture might actually come to pass. I don't know for certain if Night Wind will betray us, but when something as valuable as this egg lies in the balance, loyalties can be tested. The requiem tree egg is a treasure that is far too tempting, and there would be few consequences for breaking the rules right now. I have to be careful. Miss Mirror ended with a sigh. From what you know of Night Wind, if he really brings back the sword and claims the Requiem Tree Egg, do you think he'd go the extra mile and do something else? Hansen asked. I honestly don't know. Miss Mirror shook her head, and then she said, so we just need to be prepared. I hope that Night Wind doesn't decide to betray us, but if he does, we need a contingency in place that can keep us breathing. I'm no longer what I once was, remember. I am only king class. If we fight, I cannot hope to beat Night Wind. Our only chance of surviving is if you and I work together. Even if you and I work together, fighting a deified elite won't be easy. Hansen shook his head. Miss Mirror brushed her fingers across her bangs, smiled, and said, even if 10 ordinary kings allied together, their collective power might not be enough to defeat Night Wind. But you and I are different. If we work together, even if we cannot beat him, we should be able to keep ourselves alive. I am with you, of course, my lady. Hansen smiled. Although I have become king class, I still have the mind of a deified, and I understand Night Wind's power. I know all about Night Wind. I will just need you to do as I say. If he really tries to do something rash, we'll hold him back long enough that we can escape. Miss Mirror said. I will listen to you, my lady. Hansen answered quickly, but he had a different plan in mind. Things had become complicated. The three of them each had their own plan. Although they all had individual goals, they knew that surviving in such a place would be difficult. But none of them could resist the temptation of the Requiem Tree Egg. Although Miss Mirror hadn't said anything about it, she obviously had her own thoughts about the Requiem Tree Egg. She just hadn't been obvious about it like Night Wind. Both of them went silent. Hansen thought it wasn't a good idea to let the uncomfortable silence grow. So he started talking. Do you think Night Wind can safely retrieve that big sword? I don't know. Miss Mirror paused. It definitely seems like something is orchestrating this situation, trying to drive us to fight for the Requiem Tree Egg. Since this entity obviously seems to require the big sword, common sense should tell you that the sword is dangerous. But Night Wind went to retrieve it anyway, and he isn't stupid. Since he insisted on going, he might have an ulterior motive. Maybe. Miss Mirror didn't finish her thought, but the look on her face suggested that she was worried. Hansen picked up where Miss Mirror had left off, and he said, maybe he isn't concerned about the future that the screen seemed to foretell? Miss Mirror didn't respond. It was like a silent agreement. Hansen went on to say, if the prophecy is false, then Night Wind is fine with that. If the prophecy is true, then the person wielding the sword should be fine anyway. After all, whoever takes the sword in the prophecy will be the one who claims the egg and survives. The odds for survival are swinging wildly in Night Wind's favor, with how things currently stand. You and I cannot take him down if things go badly. Miss Mirror nodded. She agreed. But there is one thing I don't understand. How can Night Wind be sure that nothing will kill him when he grabs the sword? Hansen asked Miss Mirror. Hansen wasn't familiar with Night Wind, so he couldn't guess the answer with any confidence. Do not underestimate any deified being. Night Wind isn't the most powerful deified, but the simple fact that he reached the deified level still means a lot. Do not be misled by his apparent loyalty and service to me. It can put you on a slippery slope to a painful demise, Miss Mirror said, her voice hard. Hansen shrugged. He did not say anything more. He looked back along the path behind them, hoping to see something. Night Wind should have already returned with the sword by now. If some sort of trap had been laid on or around the sword, he should have already triggered it. But the ruined city was still deathly quiet. There wasn't a single sound. They had no way of knowing if Night Wind had removed the sword or not yet. While Hansen was thinking, a shadow appeared far down the path. It looked like Night Wind's. Indeed, when the figure drew closer, Hansen could see that it was Night Wind returning. He had a big sword slung over his shoulder, which looked just like the one they had seen before. But contrary to their expectations, the sword was only 1 meter long. The tip was flat as if it had been snapped off. The sword was broken. That surprised Miss Mirror and Hansen both, and they swapped curious glances with each other. Chapter 24:31 Tree egg comes out of the hole. Luckily, I was able to retrieve the sword. Night Wind stepped in front of Miss Mirror and bowed. He placed the sword down in front of her. The Duke was gone, so it seemed that Night Wind had gotten rid of the man. The sword was broken? Miss Mirror asked, looking directly at Night Wind. She didn't stoop to touch the sword. It seemed like a pointless question to ask, but there was a deeper meaning to her inquiry. Night Wind knew what she was asking. He immediately answered. When I pulled it out, it was broken already. And I couldn't find any pieces of the blade in the surrounding area, either. I tested what's left of the blade, and while I don't know what level it is, it could cut through the rubble like butter. Han-sun understood. Night Wind had answered 3 of Miss Mirror's questions. He wasn't the one to break the sword, and the sword hadn't broken recently. Furthermore, the sword power was still inside it. Let's see if we can use it to widen the hole in the tree, Miss Mirror instructed Night Wind, still not touching the sword herself. Han-sun knew why Miss Mirror didn't want to accept the sword. She still didn't know if Night Wind was going to betray her. If he really held traitorous intentions, he would reveal his true self and strike Miss Mirror down as soon as she took the sword. Miss Mirror didn't want to go against Night Wind just yet, so she didn't want to touch the sword. First, she wanted to see if Night Wind could cut the tree open. If he was unable to widen the hole, then the Requiem egg tree would remain beyond their reach. In that case, they would no longer have any reason to distrust each other, and they'd continue cooperating in order to remove their red-eye affliction. Night Wind was the strongest one there, so they would need his help. Let me see what I can do to free the egg, Night Wind said. And then he approached the opening in the Requiem tree. He lifted the sword and slashed toward the hole. The dark color of the blade spread, and Night Wind's dark substance chain struck the tree hole. The darkness broke and spilled everywhere. But when the blade of the broken sword slammed into the hole, it bit into the trunk of the tree, splitting the wood in a narrow gash. It works, Night Wind exulted. He pulled the broken sword free, and then continued to strike the tree hole. Wood chips flew everywhere, and the fist-sized hole got bigger and bigger. Han-sun and Miss Mirror simply stood beneath the tree watching. While the broken sword was capable of cutting the tree, the wood of the tree itself was still incredibly hard. Night Wind was making progress, but only a few centimeters were achieved with each strike. After slashing at the tree for half an hour, the hole had been expanded to the size of a frying pan's lid. The Requiem tree egg still wasn't visible through the hole, of course. We're almost there. Try to pull the egg out so that we can confirm that it's genuine, Miss Mirror said from down below. Night Wind slung the broken sword across his back. He put his hand inside and felt around until he got a firm grip on the egg. Then he pulled the egg out as far as it would go. Only the tip was showing though, as the hole was too small to pull the egg out completely. From the part of it that was showing, the Requiem tree egg appeared to be transparent. It looked like amber, in that it was tinged with a bit of gold. It looked pretty. It gave off a fragrance that awakened Han-sun's senses, like his body was being rinsed clean by some holy liquid. It is a Requiem tree egg, Night Wind said with a grin. Miss Mirror looked odd. Han-sun had never seen a Requiem tree egg before, so he didn't know what it was supposed to look like, but that gold crystal was obviously some good stuff. Once they had confirmed the nature of the orb inside the tree, Night Wind let the egg fall back into the hole, and went back to hacking at the tree trunk using the broken sword. Wood chips and shavings flew everywhere, as the hole grew steadily larger. Han-sun and Miss Mirror looked at each other. They could see the greediness and awareness in each other's eyes. Such a giant Requiem tree egg was the rarest of treasures. They all wanted it for themselves, but Night Wind was too powerful. And Han-sun and Miss Mirror couldn't predict if Night Wind would betray them. In addition to being deified, he was now wielding that deadly broken sword. If he did decide to turn on them, Han-sun and Miss Mirror would be in a lot of danger. After another hour of hacking away at the tree hole was an entire meter wide. It seemed as if they'd be able to pull the tree egg out now. Night Wind swung the broken sword across his back. He leaned into the greatly expanded hole, using his hands to try to pull the egg out into the open. Night Wind applied steady pressure, and the egg began to slide steadily, if slowly, out of the hole. The giant requiem tree egg was gold like amber, and the small section that had been revealed so far looked like the narrow end of a chicken's egg. All three of them froze as they stared not at the egg itself, but at what lay beneath the egg's transparent exterior. Within that small end of the gold egg, they could see a head. It looked like the head of someone who was either a human or one of the extreme king. The head appeared to belong to an 18-year-old girl. Her eyes were closed peacefully, and her hair appeared to be gold, but they couldn't tell if that was just the tint of the tree egg or her natural color. Her eyelashes were long. In that serene pose, she looked like Sleeping Beauty from the fairy tale. Why does the requiem tree egg have a creature inside it? Night Wind asked, looking at the tree egg with confusion. Miss Mirror looked at the tree egg, shook her head and said, I don't know. I've never heard of such a giant requiem tree egg, and I've never heard of there being life inside one of them. Is the requiem tree a xenogenic? Can the requiem tree breed and produce life? Hansen asked uncertainly. Maybe she accidentally entered the tree hole and died, and then her body was covered by resin. Maybe that is how she ended up like this. Night Wind mumbled thoughtfully to himself. Hansen's eyes suddenly hardened. He gritted his teeth and said, Now we have one more person. When Night Wind and Miss Mirror heard him, their brows furrowed. The prediction of the 6 pictures revealed 4 faceless men. They thought that they had changed things by getting rid of the Duke. When their numbers were reduced to 3, they thought they had trumped the prophecy. But now the tree egg had a human-like creature inside, and that brought their numbers back up to 4. The 3 of them looked at each other nervously. Night Wind gnashed his teeth. He wanted to push the tree egg back into the hole. But the tree egg suddenly shone with a golden light, and a wave of power tossed Night Wind away from the egg and the girl it contained. The egg shot out of the hole like a bullet, then fell to the ground where it rolled for a bit. Now that they could see the tree egg's full appearance, it was just as Miss Mirror had predicted. 2 meters tall and 1 meter wide. It was like a giant amber egg. A naked, 15-year-old girl lay inside that tree egg. Beneath the blonde hair that spread across her shoulders, they could see a tattoo covering her whole back. A 9-life cat. Hansen thought the instant he saw the tattoo. His nostrils flared, and he barely kept himself from shouting the words. Chapter 2432 The prophecy comes true. This is rather ominous, Hansen thought in his heart. He quickly reviewed the facts. There was a giant requiem tree inside Do God City. The tree contained a giant requiem egg, and there was a girl frozen within that egg. For some reason, the girl had a 9-life cat tattoo across her entire back. Hansen's mind raced for an explanation, but he couldn't come up with one. The sight of a 9-life cat tattoo on a woman's back was familiar to Hansen. This girl's tattoo looked the same as Zero's. It was exactly the same, in fact, and that was why Hansen was so shocked. Is that girl inside the egg Zero's sister? But that doesn't make sense. Do God City fell 1 billion years ago. How long has Zero been alive? It doesn't seem as if the 2 of them could be related. But then, why would they have the same tattoo on their backs? Is it the same organization's branding? Blood Legion's symbol is the 9-life cat. But Blood Legion hasn't been around as long as Do God City, and their history doesn't reach back to the time before it fell. That goddamn old cat. He must know all the answers I'm looking for. Hansen was giving himself a headache trying to figure all this out. He wanted to lay his hands on that old cat and string it up. He wanted to torture the feline so that he could learn everything it knew. Catcha! A snapping sound suddenly came from the egg, pulling Hansen out of his thoughts. A crack had formed across the golden egg. Is that girl still alive? Hansen asked in amazement, slowly taking a single step back. Miss Mirror, Night Wind, and Hansen all had the same reaction. After falling back a little ways, they stopped. They couldn't escape now. They hadn't found a cure for their red eyes, and they were sure to die if they chose to leave. But Hansen was worried about something a little different. Although he also had red eyes that he couldn't get rid of, he was more afraid that the weird power might be contagious. He didn't want to risk infecting Bauer or Ningyu. That was why he had come here. He wanted to find some way to remove the infectious power. And if this abandoned city didn't present any answers, He planned to try getting rid of the red eyes with his super god spirit body. Han Sen had no control over what was occurring, and he couldn't even tell if it was dangerous or not. He wanted to flee, but before he had time to turn and run, he heard a humming tone like the sound one might expect from a viola. The giant egg cracked like glass around the form of the blonde girl, then shattered completely. Seeing the scattered remains of the egg, Night Wind gnashed his teeth and dropped into a defensive crouch. His dark substance chains then shot out to collect all of the pieces of the egg. The egg had disintegrated and fallen to the ground, but the girl still hung in the air. Her body was curled up in fetal position, and an intriguing scent wafted from her. She smelled like the Requiem tree egg, but better. One moment Han Sen thought he could barely smell the scent, and the next moment it was almost overpowering. I don't care who or what you are. I have to kill you now. Dark substance chains circled and writhed around Night Wind's body, and he sent increasing amounts of power into the hand that wasn't holding the broken sword. After charging up his strike for a few seconds, he slashed at the girl. Night Wind had no choice. If he didn't go forward with this, the red-eye power would drive him insane. The only escape from this fate was to acquire more power. His sword of darkness tore through the air toward the sleeping girl. The girl's body looked as if it was shielded by some invisible power. When Night Wind's dark substance chains got within a foot of the girl, they shattered. His power couldn't reach her. Night Wind roared like thunder and prepared to slash with the broken sword instead. His dark substance chains were unable to damage the girl, so he poured all of his strength into the broken sword. Since the broken sword was able to damage the Requiem tree, he believed it should be able to harm the girl's seemingly delicate skin. The blade hissed through the air toward her, and it didn't explode like the dark substance chain. He slashed downwards, but the sword moved so slowly. It was like the sword was gradually slicing through some invisible substance. The sword descended toward the girl's throat. The blade was going to touch her skin. As this occurred, the girl's eyes moved beneath their eyelids. It seemed as if she was about to wake up. Her blonde hair silently waved and shimmered. To Night Wind's surprise, the girl's blonde hair rose and wrapped around the blade of the broken sword, stopping the weapon in an instant. Night Wind stared. The broken sword that could cut through the Requiem tree was unable to cut the girl's hair. Still gripping the broken sword by its handle, Night Wind used his substance chain in an attempt to pull the broken sword out of the entrapment of the girl's hair. He tugged at it a few times, but it didn't budge. The girl finally opened her eyes. She had gold irises. She looked expressionlessly at Night Wind. Either that, or she was simply looking forward, and he happened to be in the way. Night Wind was a very decisive individual. When he was unable to pull the sword from her grasp, he abandoned the sword and turned to run. Han Sen and Miss Mirror had started running as soon as Night Wind attacked the girl. Speaking of running, Han Sen was the best at that. He ran faster than Miss Mirror, and that put him in front. Miss Mirror wasn't slow, but she was king class. She wouldn't be as fast as Night Wind anymore either. Night Wind quick sped by her. Han Sen used his Dongxian area, which allowed him to see everything. Night Wind didn't slow down. He was headed past Han Sen like he was teleporting, but with his expanded vision, Han Sen saw something hit Miss Mirror in her back. She tumbled to the ground with blood bubbling over her lips. And then all of a sudden, the blonde girl was standing right next to Han Senator. Not even the Dongxian area had warned him that she was coming. Pucha! Night Wind had been moving around Han Sen, and when the blonde girl appeared, he almost bumped into her. He raised his arms to defend himself, but it was too late. The blonde girl was holding the broken sword, and she thrust it into Night Wind's heart with an almost casual motion. Time stood still. Miss Mirror was on the ground. Han Sen was standing next to the blonde girl, and the blonde girl had stabbed the broken sword into Night Wind's chest. It was just like the fourth picture. Was it really a prophetic drawing? Han Sen wondered. The only thing he knew for sure was that he would be unable to escape the girl. Not even the deified Night Wind had stood a chance against her speed. Night Wind had been stabbed, and his face hadn't changed a bit. He did not have blood ooze from his chest either. His body simply melted into the darkness and became formless. Then he went to space. The blonde-haired girl was still holding the broken sword in its thrusting position. She did not blink, and she still looked incredibly cold. It was like she had no focus. But that broken sword's symbols had some golden flames on it. The broken sword was burning like a sun. It was shining with a scary golden light. Arg! Night Wind had become one with the darkness. Not even the broken sword cut hurt him now, but he screamed when the sun-like gold light shined on him. His body was fading into the gold light that was like a sun. It only took a second to completely destroy his life force. Han Sun felt a chill. Night Wind was a deified elite, and he had been killed in moments. Chapter 2433 Deadlock. Miss Mirror was severely injured, and she wouldn't be getting back to her feet anytime soon. Blood continued to trickle past her lips, but luckily, her life force still seemed stable. She was wounded but not dying. Han Sun turned around and looked at the blonde girl, and he noticed that she had turned around to look at him too. They stared at each other, only a single step separating them. What the hell is happening right now? Han Sun wondered. His heart was pounding like it was about to jump out of his chest, and he considered teleporting to the sanctuaries immediately. This blonde girl had just executed a deified elite, as easily as Han Sun might step on an insect. Attempting to fight her would be a death wish. Han Sun didn't want to die, so he didn't attempt to fight back, or make any moves that the girl might interpret as aggression. But when Han Sun saw the girl's eyes, he resisted the urge to hop back to the sanctuaries. She didn't look murderous. Of course, that wasn't the most important reason that Han Sun was staying here, rather than fleeing to the sanctuaries. He could already tell that the girl could strike with her sword much more quickly than Han Sun could use the Blood Pulse Sutra to open a portal. She could cut his head off before he even finished summoning power. So instead of running or fighting, both of them just stood there. Han Sun didn't move. He was afraid that any motion on his part might cause the blonde girl to attack. But the blonde girl just stood where she was, not attacking. She looked in Han Sun's direction, but her eyes didn't seem focused. It was hard to tell if she really was looking at him. Han Sun remained motionless as cold sweat beaded on his brow. The scary girl was as still as stone, and they had been staring at each other for 10 minutes. If they had been in a bar or pub, staring at a beautiful blonde girl for a prolonged amount of time would have been an enjoyable, relaxing thing for Han Senator. Instead, they were in an abandoned city in a cursed land, and Han Sun was anything but relaxed. Looking at a pretty girl was like looking at a beautiful painting. Han Sun didn't need to touch it to enjoy the experience. But right now, Han Sun had difficulty breathing under the pressure. Every second felt as long as a century. That girl was pretty indeed. She was like a blonde princess from a fairy tale. But no matter how attractive she was, thinking about how easily she had just killed a deified extreme king kept Han Sun from calming himself down. Who knew when she might suddenly decide to cut Han Sun in half with a single swing of her sword? You should move. Show me a sign. Are we fighting or seeking peace? Han Sun thought desperately. Sweat was running down his face now. He thought of a million ideas, but the girl was still just looking at him. Her eyes were dull, like she was badly dazed. Han Sun gritted his teeth. He gradually moved his foot, wanting to step away from her, wondering if he could walk off slowly without disturbing her. But he had only taken half a step when the blonde girl took one whole step toward Han Senator. She almost bumped into him. Han Sun immediately stopped, which made the girl stop as well. Both of them were much closer now. Han Sun could almost feel the girl's breath, and he could smell her perfume again. Han Sun didn't move, and the girl didn't either. The two of them continued to stare at each other again. Oh my God, what is happening here? Is this girl really a princess? Does she think I am so handsome that she doesn't want to kill me? Does she want to marry me instead? Just tell me if you want to marry me. Don't just stand there doing nothing. It's creepy. Han Sun thought. If this girl liked him, she should summon her courage and tell him. If she was in love with him, that was totally fine. It was better than killing him anyway. If something didn't happen soon, the tension was going to make Han Sun explode. The girl clearly hadn't noticed how rigid and uncomfortable he was. Her eyes were still unfocused. When she stepped forward as he stepped away, it was probably a subconscious reaction. Han Sun didn't know what the girl would do once she woke up. If she had injured Miss Mirror and killed Night Wind without even being fully conscious, she must be pretty scary. Then Han Sun remembered something that made it seem even less likely that this would end well for him. The first 4 pictures on the screen had already come true. When Han Sun remembered the scene from the 5th picture, his heart began beating even faster. In the 5th picture, one faceless man had been lying on the ground, and 2 other faceless men appeared to be fighting. One of them was gripping the other's neck. Han Sun could guess that the faceless man on the ground represented Miss Mirror, which meant that the fighting faceless men were the girl and himself. If he fought someone with her power, there was no way he could win. Thinking of Miss Mirror, Han Sun glanced over at her. She was in a much better condition, and her wounds were healing quickly. But she lay on the ground, not attempting to get up or run away. Why isn't she running? Han Sun thought to himself. Then he understood. She must have remembered the 5th picture as well. If the 5th picture came true, she might be the safest by remaining on the ground. If she got up to run, perhaps she would end up as the one fighting. So evil, Han Sun thought. The girl still hadn't moved, but it did seem as if her eyes were starting to brighten. She was slowly starting to wake up. Han Sun kept thinking, if those pictures are true, then only 2 faceless men will exist by the 6th picture. One will be on the floor, and the other will be kneeling in prayer before the statue with 1,000 hands and 1,000 eyes. I don't know if the one on the floor is dead or alive. If they are alive, then that means either Miss Mirror or I will survive. Only one of us will live, but that doesn't matter. Miss Mirror will be the one who dies. I will be the one who gets out. Han Sun was confident about this. He was very confident because he had the super god spirit body. He couldn't beat the girl, but he could use the short period of invincibility to return to the sanctuary. Han Sun continued to think, and Miss Mirror remained on the ground, waiting for some chance. The girl, meanwhile, was looking at Han Senator. None of them were moving. It was like time had stood still, and everything was silent. Life and awareness were flowing back into the girl's eyes. Only her eyes seemed to change, but somehow, they made her whole body seem different. She had moved like an emotionless killing machine when she first came out of the egg, but now she seemed like a real human. The girl blinked, and Han Sen's heart jumped in response. With this girl now awake, God only knew what she might do. After the girl blinked, she seemed to come back to herself fully. She saw Han Sun and so she moved. She jumped to him and grabbed him by the neck. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.